Welcome to Verified Fears, where we document the real encounters that night shift rangers refuse to forget. Deep in America's wettest rainforests, a ranger's radio went silent at 2 a.m., and when he finally responded hours later, he couldn't explain where he'd been. Documented cases from the Pacific Northwest reveal something far worse than wildlife is watching them. These are verified encounters that changed how rangers understand what lurks in the darkness. My headlamp caught the cabin's edge through the fog, and I knew immediately it shouldn't be there. I was 3 hours into my midnight patrol of the Hoh Rainforest when the GPS anomaly flagged. A structure in a sector I'd walked 200 times without incident. November rain hammered the canopy above, turning everything into a wet blur. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and my breath fogged in the beam of my light. I'd been doing night shift ranger work for 8 years, and I knew every inch of this forest on paper. The cabin wasn't on any map I'd ever seen. The structure materialized through the mist like it was emerging from water. Old. Impossibly old. The wooden frame had settled into the forest floor, moss thick enough to muffle footsteps. The door hung slightly open, and I could see the edge of what looked like a table inside. My radio crackled with static. Dead zone, common this deep in the rainforest. I called it in anyway, knowing the message wouldn't transmit. My voice died in the fog. I approached carefully, Ranger protocol automatic in my movements. My hand went to the bear spray on my belt, not because I expected wildlife, but because something about the structure felt watched. The interior was dim, even with my headlamp. Coffee, fresh coffee. The smell hit me first, impossible and wrong. On the table sat a ceramic mug, steam rising in thin tendrils. Next to it lay a leather-bound logbook, pages yellowed with age, but the handwriting fresh and deliberate. I picked up the logbook with trembling hands. The first entry was dated 1957. Ranger observations, wildlife counts, weather patterns. But the handwriting changed entries. Different ink, different pens, spanning decades, all ending with entries from the past month. October 2024. This week. My week. I turned pages methodically, my mind rejecting what I was reading. The final entry was dated 2 days ago. It contained a detailed description of my patrol route, my exact movements, my sleep schedule at the ranger station 12 miles away, names of people I knew, descriptions of conversations I'd had with Leandro, my supervisor, about staffing changes. The cabin's interior walls were covered in photographs pinned directly into the wood. Rangers, modern rangers, me, Frankie Coulter from the northern sector, Angie Martinez from wildlife management, Lyric Chen from the environmental assessment team. Dozens of us, caught in candid moments around the station, on trails, entering our homes outside the forest. Some photos were recent, some were older, dating back years. Each photograph had handwritten notes beneath it in meticulous detail. Our names, our shift schedules, our vulnerabilities. I backed toward the door, the logbook still in my hands. My training told me to document this, to secure the scene, but my instincts screamed at me to move. The coffee was still hot, steam still rising. That meant someone had been here within the last hour, within my patrol window. I swept my headlamp across the walls again, and that's when I saw the photographs behind the door, the ones I'd missed on entry. They were different. They showed rangers sleeping, in their beds, in the ranger station. The images were taken from inside the buildings, through windows, from close angles. One photograph showed me in my bunk, asleep, taken from less than 3 feet away. The timestamp on the back was from last night. I ran. 8 years of professional composure evaporated into pure animal response. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at my jacket, my headlamp swinging wildly. The fog seemed to close in tighter, and I could hear nothing but the roar of blood in my ears and the sucking sound of my boots in the wet earth. My radio was worthless. My phone had no signal. I was alone in the dark with someone who knew exactly where to find me. When I reached the ranger station 2 hours later, soaked and breathing in ragged gasps, I immediately called the state police. They found the cabin exactly where my GPS coordinates indicated. Inside, they found the logbook, the photographs, the coffee cup. But the liquid in the mug was stone cold, and lab analysis showed it had been sitting there for at least 2 weeks. The photographs were professional quality, printed on expensive paper, but the ink analysis dated them to between 1995 and 2003. The handwriting in the logbook shifted styles across the decades in ways that seemed impossible for a single person to maintain. The ranger station security footage showed no one entering the buildings during the times the photographs were supposedly taken. And no one has ever explained who was living in that cabin, maintaining those records, or why they stopped the day after we found it. I still can't explain how someone was watching us from inside our own buildings, or how that cabin existed without appearing on a single official survey in 70 years. The smell hit Rocco first. Decay so thick it coated the back of his throat like oil. He was conducting a midnight wildlife survey along the abandoned logging roads in Tongass National Forest, Alaska, a sector that hadn't seen active timber operations in 15 years. October rain fell in sheets, near freezing and relentless, reducing visibility through his headlamp to maybe 20 feet. The temperature hovered around 38 degrees, and the forest itself seemed to absorb sound. No wind through the canopy, no animal calls, just the constant percussion of rain on dead wood and the squelch of his boots in saturated earth. Rocco had been a seasonal ranger for 3 years, rotating through the remote sections of Alaska's largest national forest. And he'd learned that silence in Tongass usually meant something was wrong. The first salmon he found was positioned deliberately across the center of the road, arranged with its head pointing northwest and its tail curled in an exact 90-degree angle. Not dragged there by scavengers, not scattered by natural decomposition. Positioned. Rocco knelt beside it, his headlamp beam catching the peculiar geometry of the carcass. The fish's scales still held faint iridescence despite the advanced stages of decay. He documented the GPS coordinates in his field notebook, photographed it from multiple angles, and continued his patrol. 5 minutes later, he found another salmon, this one perpendicular to the first, forming a perfect cross on the logging road. Then another, and another. Within an hour, Rocco had counted 47 salmon arranged in deliberate patterns across a quarter-mile section of abandoned road. Some formed geometric shapes: triangles, squares, diamonds. Others were arranged in sequences that suggested a progression or counting system. His scientific mind cataloged possibilities: spawning aggregation, disease die-off, unusual migration behavior. But spawning salmon didn't arrange themselves in mathematical patterns. Disease didn't create geometry. The patterns grew more complex the deeper he followed the road, and fresh drag marks in the mud indicated the fish were still being positioned, still being arranged. The moisture in the marks suggested activity within the last 12 hours. Rocco's breathing quickened as he pressed forward. His radio clipped to his belt, transmitting only static in this dead zone. The patterns became more elaborate: spirals, concentric circles, arrows pointing deeper into the restricted timber area where access was officially prohibited. His training told him to mark the location and report to headquarters in the morning. His instinct screamed that he was following a trail someone wanted him to follow. The smell of decomposition intensified, now mixed with something else. Something organic and wrong, like fermented copper. His headlamp caught movement in the trees ahead, something massive shifting between the trunks. He stopped, aiming his light at the motion, but nothing was there. Only rain and darkness and the geometric arrangement of dead fish stretching before him into the fog. The logging road curved sharply, and when Rocco rounded the bend, he found them. Hundreds of salmon, thousands perhaps, arranged in a massive spiral pattern that covered the entire width of the road and extended maybe 60 yards forward. The center point of the spiral was marked with something else, something pale and roughly cylindrical. Rocco's headlamp illuminated the object as he approached. A human femur, old and weathered, positioned vertically with smaller bones arranged in a circle around its base. His hand instinctively went to the bear spray on his belt, but his mind was already calculating. The bone was too old to be recent. The spiral had been constructed around it deliberately, intentionally, as if the arrangement had been planned long before. He took photographs with shaking hands, his training overriding the primal fear response that wanted him to run. The bone showed signs of having been cleaned, not by natural scavenging, but by deliberate removal of soft tissue. Animal marks were present, but organized, methodical. As Rocco documented the scene, he realized the spiral pattern was directional. The fish were arranged to guide movement forward, deeper into the restricted zone, away from the main logging road, away from where anyone would find him if he didn't return by dawn. That's when Rocco heard the footsteps. They came from ahead on the road, slow and deliberate, moving closer through the rain. The sound was unmistakably human. Boot step patterns, the distinctive rhythm of someone walking with purpose. Rocco's headlamp swept forward, but illuminated only empty road and falling rain. The footsteps continued, closer now, but his light caught nothing. No figure, no shape, no reflection. Just the sound of someone walking directly toward him through the darkness. Rocco backed away slowly, his headlamp trained on the empty road ahead, the beam cutting through rain and mist, but revealing nothing. His breathing had become shallow, controlled, ranger training kicking in despite the visceral terror climbing his spine. The footsteps continued their measured approach, closer now, maybe 30 feet away. He could hear the distinctive sound of boots on wet gravel, the subtle squelch of earth compressing under weight. But his light found nothing. No silhouette, no shape breaking the darkness. Just the sound of someone walking directly toward him through the rain, as if the night itself had weight and footfalls. He keyed his radio, though he knew the dead zone would swallow his voice. "This is Rocco Valdez, Ranger Designation 447, reporting unidentified audio contact on restricted logging road sector 7, Tongass National Forest." Static answered him. He tried again, repeating the message, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The footsteps never hesitated. They kept coming with mechanical precision, each step identical to the last, the sound of someone who knew exactly where they were walking despite moving through absolute darkness. Rocco turned and began walking backward, keeping his headlamp pointed at the empty space where the footsteps were coming from. His hand found the bear spray canister on his belt, fingers wrapping around it. The footsteps matched his pace. When he walked faster, they accelerated. When he slowed, they slowed. The thing that terrified him most wasn't the invisible presence. It was the deliberate matching of his movements, as if whatever was making those sounds was maintaining a specific distance, testing his reactions, playing a game with established rules. He turned and ran. The logging road was rutted and treacherous, muddy from 3 weeks of rain. But Rocco knew these paths. His headlamp bounced wildly as he sprinted, the spiral of salmon blurring past on either side. Behind him, the footsteps maintained their pace, never breaking rhythm, never faltering on the difficult terrain. For something invisible, it moved with impressive confidence. Rocco's lungs burned as he pushed harder, his boots slipping in the mud, his free hand extended to catch himself if he fell. The dead zone was still intact. His radio continued to broadcast only static. He was completely isolated. The logging road began to curve back toward the main forest access point, and Rocco risked a glance over his shoulder. His headlamp caught something in the rain behind him. Not a figure, but a disturbance, or in the mist itself, as if the air was being displaced by something massive moving through it. The footsteps had stopped. In their place came a new sound. Something large moving through the underbrush alongside the road, parallel to his path, keeping pace with his sprint. Rocco's truck was still 3 miles away. The main ranger station was 8 miles in the opposite direction. He was caught between 2 impossible distances, with something tracking him through the darkness. His training fragmented under the pressure of raw survival instinct. He cut hard to the right, leaving the logging road and plunging into the forest itself, crashing through vegetation and down timber. The sound in the brush followed, no longer bothering with the road, moving with terrible purpose through the undergrowth. The forest floor was a minefield of obstacles, rotting logs, exposed root systems, hidden rocks beneath inches of moss and pine needles. Rocco crashed over a deadfall, his headlamp spinning through darkness, catching momentary glimpses of his surroundings. Ancient spruce trees rose like columns in the night. Moss hung from branches in long strands, looking almost organic in the flashlight beam. Behind him, the crash of the thing pursuing him grew closer, no longer attempting stealth, no longer maintaining that mechanical distance. Something had changed. The hunting had begun. He burst through a thicket and suddenly found himself at the edge of a ravine. His boots skidded on loose shale as he tried to stop, and for a moment he teetered at the precipice, staring down into absolute darkness. His headlamp couldn't penetrate to the bottom. The ravine was easily 40 feet deep, maybe more. Behind him, the crashing stopped. The thing had reached the clearing at the ravine's edge. Rocco's headlamp swung around to illuminate what had been chasing him. The beam caught nothing. The clearing was empty. But the sound continued. A deep, wet breathing, like something with massive lungs drawing air through fluid-filled passages. The smell intensified too, that fermented copper scent mixed with something like sulfur. The breathing came from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding him, emanating from the trees themselves. In that moment of frozen terror, Rocco made a decision that probably saved his life. He jumped, 38 feet into darkness, into a ravine he couldn't see, trusting that the forest floor was actually there and not a drop into some deeper hell. He crashed through brush and saplings, his body tumbling, his headlamp spinning wildly. He hit bottom hard, something cracking in his ribs, the air exploding from his lungs. He lay in the dark creek bed, gasping, unable to move, unable to think beyond the immediate agony of impact. Above him, at the ravine's edge, something stood silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky. Rocco couldn't see details in the darkness, but he could make out the massive shape, impossibly tall, broader than anything natural, its proportions wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. It didn't move. It simply stood there, breathing that terrible wet breathing, as if deciding whether to follow him down into the ravine. Then it turned and walked away, back toward the logging road, back toward the spiral of salmon, arranged like a message on the muddy earth. Rocco didn't move for an hour. He lay in the creek bed, breathing in shallow gasps, trying to keep the pain in his ribs from overwhelming him. His headlamp battery died sometime during that hour, leaving him in complete darkness. When he finally felt confident enough to move, he climbed out of the ravine slowly, carefully, his right arm cradling his ribs. The clearing at the top was empty. The forest had returned to its normal dead silence. He made it back to his truck 4 hours later, limping through the darkness with a dead headlamp, relying on the faint light of dawn beginning to touch the eastern sky. The logging road was empty. The spiral of salmon was gone. Every single fish had been removed, leaving only the muddy road and the marks where they'd lain. The human femur that had marked the center of the spiral was gone too. He drove directly to the ranger station and filed a report with James Whitmore, his supervisor. Wildlife biologists were sent to investigate. They found no evidence of the salmon aggregation, no photographs in the digital files. Rocco's camera had been damaged in the fall into the ravine, corrupting the memory card. The only physical evidence remaining was a human femur that had washed up in the creek valley 3 days later, carbon dated to approximately 1987, with no identification markers and no explanation for how it ended up in Tongass National Forest. Rocco submitted his resignation a week later. He cited personal reasons and a desire to pursue opportunities outside the Forestry Service. The State Wildlife Department filed his report under Unconfirmed Wildlife Encounter, Likely Predator Misidentification. The incident was closed. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the rain falls on the logging roads of Tongass, park rangers report hearing footsteps on the abandoned timber paths. The sound of something walking with perfect rhythm, never accelerating, never stopping, as if it's still searching for whoever made the spiral on the muddy earth all those years ago. And nobody has ever explained what arranged thousands of salmon in geometric patterns, or what stood at the edge of that ravine, breathing something that wasn't quite air. The water was rising 6 inches every hour, and James Whitmore had no explanation for why. He was conducting a flood assessment in the Hoh Rainforest, Washington, a sector that had received unprecedented rainfall over the past 72 hours. The National Weather Service predicted peak water levels by dawn, but James's measurements suggested something beyond normal precipitation dynamics. It was 11 p.m. when he waded into the lower survey zone, water already waist-deep in areas that had been dry mud just hours before. The air was warm despite the season, almost humid in a way that felt wrong for late April, and mist rose from the dark water in thick columns that obscured visibility beyond 10 feet. James had been a senior ranger for 16 years, and he'd worked flood assessments in every major rainforest ecosystem in the Pacific Northwest. This was different. The trees were groaning, not wind-caused creaking, but a deep structural stress, the sound of wood fiber separating under hydraulic pressure. James moved deeper into the survey zone, his waders keeping the water at chest level, his measuring equipment strapped to his vest. He'd been documenting water levels at fixed survey markers, recording observations that would feed into the state's hydrological database. The measurements were consistent, water rising approximately 6 inches every 60 minutes. At that rate, the assessment zone would be completely submerged by daylight. The forest around him was beginning to panic in its own way. Birds making distress calls, smaller mammals moving higher into the canopy, the ambient sounds of the ecosystem in flux. James marked his position on the GPS unit and prepared to move to the next survey station, located another 200 yards deeper into the forest. That's when he noticed the bodies. At first, he thought they were debris. logs or branches moving with the current. But as his headlamp beam caught them, he realized they were human. Two of them, maybe three, standing upright in the dark water about 30 yards ahead of his position. They weren't moving. They weren't floating. They were simply standing there, fully submerged from the neck down, their heads above water, faces tilted downward as if asleep or unconscious. James's first instinct was rescue protocol. He moved toward them quickly, his waders pushing through the current, calling out in case they were conscious. No response. As he got closer, maybe 15 feet away, his headlamp illuminated their faces clearly. They were pale, completely drained of color. Their lips had taken on a bluish tint that suggested hypothermia or prolonged water exposure. Their eyes were open but unfocused, staring downward at the water around them. James recognized the uniform on one of them. A ranger's jacket, faded with age, the fabric rotted in places, but still bearing the Forest Service insignia. The jacket had to be decades old. He reached for the nearest body, his hands breaking the surface of the dark water. The moment his fingers touched the ranger's shoulder, the body toppled forward, collapsing into the water like something that had been held upright by invisible support. James jumped backward, his heart hammering. The other bodies remained standing, completely still, as if his contact with the first one had no effect on them. He turned to scan the water around him with his headlamp, and that's when he realized the truth. There were dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, scattered throughout the submerged forest in every direction, all standing upright, all facing downward, all perfectly silent. The water continued to rise. James watched it climb, marking a tree trunk with his measuring pen at the current level, then waiting in stunned silence as the water line advanced visibly upward. 6 inches, 8 inches, 10 inches higher. The standing bodies remained motionless as the water crept up their chests, their necks, their chins. They made no attempt to move, no attempt to breathe. They simply stood there as the forest swallowed them, their faces disappearing last beneath the dark surface. James's training fractured. Every protocol told him to document, to record, to maintain objective observation. But his survival instincts screamed something different. He turned and began wading back toward higher ground, moving as quickly as the water would allow. Behind him, he could feel a change in the forest. A shift in pressure, a sense of vast attention focusing on his movement. The mist rising from the water seemed to gather, to thicken, to follow him as he pushed through the current. That's when he heard the breathing. It came from the water itself, a deep, rhythmic sound, like something massive drawing air through the dark liquid. Multiple voices, James realized. Dozens of them, breathing in perfect synchronization, a pattern that suggested coordination, intent. He stopped moving, his body half submerged, and forced himself to turn around. His headlamp beam cut through the mist, illuminating the water behind him. The surface was still, but the breathing continued, surrounding him, emanating from every direction. Dozens of pale faces were rising from the water now, eyes still closed, mouths opening in unison. The breathing became louder, more synchronized, a sound like wind moving through a massive hollow chamber. James realized with horrifying clarity that the water itself was alive. Not literally alive, but animated by something, controlled by something. And it was drawing him deeper with every moment he hesitated. The current around his legs had become stronger, more purposeful, pulling him back toward the deeper forest zones where the water was darkest and the mist was thickest. James fought against the current, his legs pumping through water that had now reached his ribs. The synchronized breathing from the submerged faces had stopped. But the silence that followed was somehow worse. It pressed against his eardrums like physical weight. His headlamp beam swept across the dark water, catching glimpses of pale skin, closed eyes, mouths slightly open. The faces were everywhere now, not just scattered through the forest, but rising from beneath the surface in increasing numbers. It was as if the water itself was birthing them, pulling them up from some deep place beneath the forest floor. He forced himself to move faster, abandoning the careful wading technique and instead thrashing through the water with raw desperation. His waders caught on submerged branches, threatening to drag him down. But he kicked free and continued pushing uphill. The water level had climbed another foot in the time he'd been standing motionless. What had been waist-deep just minutes ago was now shoulder-deep. His GPS unit gave him a bearing toward a higher elevation. The ridge was maybe a half-mile away. He could make it if the water didn't rise faster. Behind him, he heard the sound of movement. Not the synchronized breathing anymore, but actual motion through the water. The pale figures were beginning to move. He didn't turn to look. He knew that if he saw them clearly, if he saw them walking or swimming or whatever they were doing, his mind would fracture completely. His hearing was already playing tricks on him. He could swear he heard whispering, words spoken in voices that sounded almost familiar, names being called from beneath the dark surface. The forest around him had taken on a nightmarish quality. The trees were still groaning under the hydraulic pressure, but now they were leaning, beginning to topple as their root systems lost purchase in the waterlogged earth. One massive spruce went down about 50 yards to James's left, crashing through the canopy with a sound like the world breaking. Where it fell, the water seemed to rush in to fill the void, as if drawn to the opening. James realized with sickening clarity that the forest wasn't just flooding, it was drowning. The water level continued its inexorable rise, and there was no external source. No breach in a dam, no overflow from a creek. The water was coming from below, welling up from the earth itself, and it had no intention of stopping. He stumbled over something solid beneath the water and went down hard, his face plunging into the dark liquid. It was warm, almost body temperature, and it tasted of minerals and something organic, something that made his throat close in involuntary rejection. He surfaced, gasping, clearing his mouth and nose, and that's when he heard the voice clearly. It was speaking from directly behind him, just a few feet away, and it was using his name. James. James, it's okay. We're here now. You can rest. You can stop fighting. He spun around, his headlamp beam catching nothing but dark water and mist. The voice had sounded like his father. His father had died 23 years ago. The voice came again, from a different direction this time, still sounding like his father, but also like something else, layered, as if multiple voices were speaking in perfect unison, creating the illusion of a single speaker. James, we've been waiting for you. We've been in the water so long, it's so cold down there. It's so dark. Come down with us. Come and be warm. The pale figures were closer now. James could see them clearly as they moved through the water with an unsettling gliding motion. They didn't walk. They didn't swim. They moved as if the water itself was carrying them, propelling them toward him with patient inevitability. Their faces were becoming clearer in the beam of his headlamp. And that's when recognition struck him like a fist. He knew some of them. A ranger named Donovan, who'd been reported missing in 1987. A park biologist named Leandro, who'd disappeared during a survey in 1993. A wildlife photographer named Rio, whose camp had been found abandoned in 1998 with no trace of the man himself. James recognized at least 15 of them, all missing persons from the Pacific Northwest, all reported lost in various locations over the past 4 decades. All standing here in the dark water of the Hoh Rainforest, their eyes beginning to open, their mouths beginning to move in that synchronized breathing pattern. He ran, not waiting anymore, but actually running through the water, abandoning any attempt at caution or conservation of energy. His waders filled with water, becoming heavy and restrictive, but he kept moving. The elevation was rising beneath his feet now. The ridge was close, maybe 200 yards away. Behind him, the sound of multiple bodies moving through the water grew louder. They weren't pursuing him aggressively. They were moving with a kind of patient certainty, as if they knew exactly where he was going and had already positioned themselves to intercept him. The water was only waist-deep now, knee-deep, ankle-deep. James dragged himself onto higher ground and immediately collapsed, his lungs burning, his legs barely functional. He turned to look back at the water below, and what he saw will stay with him for the rest of his life. The entire lower forest zone was now completely submerged beneath water that had risen to approximately 15 feet above normal levels. The water was still rising, creeping up the ridge with terrifying patience. And in that water, illuminated by his headlamp beam, he could see the faces. Hundreds of them now. Thousands, perhaps, pressed against the surface from below, their eyes open, their mouths moving in unison, all of them speaking his name. James scrambled backward, his hands scraping raw on rocks and root systems, until he'd retreated nearly 50 yards up the ridge. He sat in the darkness, his headlamp dying battery casting only a faint glow, and watched the water continue to rise. It climbed 15 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet above the normal forest floor level. The trees were now completely submerged, their upper canopy disappearing beneath the dark surface. The sound of the breathing followed him, carried on the mist that continued to rise from the water's surface, speaking in voices he recognized from his past. People he'd known, rangers he'd worked with, his own family members all calling his name from the depths. The water stopped rising at approximately 32 feet above the original survey marker. It held at that level for 6 hours while James sat on the ridge, unable to move, unable to think beyond the moment. When dawn broke, the water was gone. Completely gone. The forest floor was wet but not flooded. The trees were still standing, their upper branches undamaged. The only evidence that anything unusual had occurred was a thick layer of mud and what appeared to be human remains, decomposed beyond immediate identification, scattered across the forest floor where the water had been. The state forensics team identified 7 bodies. All were confirmed missing persons from cases spanning 37 years. Some of the skeletal remains showed signs of decay, consistent with their presumed death dates. Some showed signs of more recent preservation. All of them bore a peculiar condition. Their lungs were filled with a sediment-rich fluid that wasn't water, but something that seemed to exist somewhere between liquid and solid state. The medical examiner had never encountered anything like it. The samples were sent to research institutions across the country and remain unidentified. James Whitmore submitted his resignation the following week. He cited respiratory complications from the flood exposure and a desire to pursue other interests outside the Forestry Service. The State Water Resources Division investigated the flooding event and concluded it was an isolated hydrogeological anomaly, possibly related to a temporary subsurface aquifer breach that had sealed itself naturally. The incident was filed under unusual natural occurrence, and the forest was reopened for public use within a month. But the water level in the Hoh Rainforest has been rising steadily every year since the incident. Not dramatically enough to draw official attention, but enough that experienced rangers have noticed the shift. Some sections of the forest that were once dry during late spring are now perpetually waterlogged. Wildlife migration patterns have changed. The forest itself seems to be slowly becoming something different, something wetter, as if it's gradually transitioning into something closer to an aquatic ecosystem than a rainforest. And nobody has ever explained why the missing person's remains were found in a forest that floods in a single night with water that comes from nowhere, or why so many of them seem to have been preserved rather than decomposed, as if something had been keeping them fresh, keeping them alive in some form that existed between death and continuation. Diana Torres found the first bear trap at dawn, and she knew immediately someone had been expecting her. She was conducting illegal camping enforcement in the Hoh National Forest, Oregon, tracking a suspected long-term squatter who had evaded ranger patrols for nearly a decade. The morning was unseasonably humid despite early September, and the dense canopy reduced visibility to maybe 30 yards in any direction. Diana had been a ranger for 5 years, specializing in backcountry enforcement, and she'd learned to read the forest like a book. The placement of camps, the patterns of human movement, the subtle signs of habitation that hikers and casual trespassers always left behind. This camp was different. Whoever had established it knew exactly what they were doing. The trap Diana found was professionally constructed, positioned on the main game trail leading deeper into the suspect sector, partially concealed beneath leaf litter and branches. A steel jaws mechanism with a chain anchor. The kind of thing a person would use to catch large predators, or to seriously injure someone who triggered it. She photographed the trap with her agency phone and marked its location on her GPS unit. Protocol dictated that she report it to headquarters and request backup. But Diana knew that by the time backup arrived, the evidence would be gone. Whoever had set the trap would move it or dismantle it completely. She made the decision to proceed alone, documenting everything, her hand resting on the bear spray canister on her utility belt. The forest around her had taken on a peculiar quality. The usual ambient sounds of wildlife seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. She continued forward, moving carefully, watching for additional traps. She found 7 more traps over the next 200 yards. Each one was professionally constructed, each one was positioned at strategic points along the trail, and each one was clearly designed to inflict maximum damage rather than capture. The final trap was positioned directly in front of what appeared to be a structure, a lean-to shelter constructed from saplings and camouflage netting, practically invisible unless you were standing directly in front of it. Diana approached cautiously, her camera documenting everything, her mind already cataloging the evidence. Illegal habitation, concealment of structures on federal land, possession of wildlife traps without proper permits. These were serious violations that could result in felony charges. That's when she saw the warnings. They were carved into the trees surrounding the structure. Deep gouges in the bark, deliberate and aggressive, arranged in a pattern that framed the shelter. The carvings were messages. Private property. Stay out. Violators will be harmed. And more disturbing phrases carved in what looked like dozens of different hands, different styles, different levels of weathering. Some carvings were fresh, maybe weeks old. Some were ancient, the bark having healed around them, suggesting they'd been here for decades. Diana photographed each one, her skin prickling with a growing sense of dread. Whoever was living here had been living here for a very long time, and they had systematically left warnings for anyone foolish enough to venture into their territory. The shelter's interior revealed the extent of the habitation. There was bedding made from animal hides, a crude stone fire pit with ash and charred bone, storage containers fashioned from hollowed logs, and something that made Diana's breath catch, a collection of photographs pinned to the interior walls. Dozens of them, all of them showing rangers, modern rangers, Park Service personnel. Some of the photographs were recent, showing people in current uniform designs. Some were older, showing rangers in uniforms that hadn't been used for 20 years. All of them appeared to have been taken without the subject's knowledge, captured through the long lens of a telephoto camera from significant distance. Below each photograph was a name, written in meticulous handwriting, along with notes about the person's routine, shift schedule, and habits. Diana's name was there, listed with dozens of photographs of herself, taken over the past 5 years, documenting her regular patrol routes, her typical arrival times, her patterns of behavior. The notes beneath her photographs were detailed and disturbing, describing her eating habits, her tendency to stop at specific locations, her daily routine with frightening accuracy. Diana stepped backward, her hand going to her radio. She keyed it, knowing the dead zone would likely swallow her transmission, and reported her position and the evidence she'd discovered. Static answered her. Behind the shelter, she found evidence of something else. Something that turned her professional detachment into genuine horror. There was a grave. Multiple graves, actually, marked with stones arranged in deliberate patterns. At least a dozen of them, arranged in rows like a cemetery. Some of the grave markers had dates carved into them. The oldest was dated 1984. The most recent was dated 2019. Diana counted them again, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. 12 graves. 12 people who had apparently ventured into this territory and never left. She was photographing the grave sites when she heard the footsteps. They came from deep in the forest, moving with deliberate purpose through the undergrowth. Multiple people, she realized. At least 3 or 4 of them, moving in a coordinated pattern, closing in on the shelter from different directions. Diana's training took over immediately. She abandoned the shelter, moving quickly but quietly away from the grave sites, her hand on her bear spray as she began making her way back toward the main forest road. Behind her, the footsteps changed direction, adjusting to match her course. They weren't trying to hide anymore. They were letting her know they were coming. The forest around her seemed to shift. Paths that she could have sworn existed moments before now seemed blocked by fallen trees and dense undergrowth. The geography began to feel wrong, disoriented, as if the forest itself was channeling her in specific directions. Diana realized with growing horror that she wasn't finding her way out. She was being guided. The footsteps behind her matched her pace, maintaining a constant distance, never accelerating, never falling behind. She tried to run, but her boots caught on hidden roots and exposed stones. The canopy above seemed to press lower, the branches creating a lattice that made forward progress increasingly difficult. Diana stopped running. She forced herself to halt, to breathe, to think like a ranger rather than prey. The footsteps behind her also stopped, as if whoever was pursuing her was waiting to see what she would do next. She pulled out her GPS unit, checking her coordinates, trying to establish her bearing relative to the main forest road. The GPS showed her location clearly, but when she looked at the terrain around her, nothing matched the topography displayed on the screen. According to the unit, she should be standing in an open area near a ridge. Instead, she was surrounded by dense forest on all sides, the canopy so thick that her headlamp beam couldn't penetrate more than 20 feet in any direction. She keyed her radio again, giving a situation report in clear, professional language. "This is Ranger Torres. Designation 289. Reporting possible hostile contact in Enforcement Sector 7, Hoh National Forest." I am currently located at coordinates. She read off the GPS numbers, then waited. Static, always static. The dead zone that covered most of the deep forest sectors had apparently expanded, or whoever was in the forest with her was using radio jamming equipment. Diana checked her phone. No signal. No way to call for backup. No way to contact the outside world. The footsteps resumed. Closer now. Diana could hear breathing. Heavy, deliberate breathing. The sound of someone who wasn't even trying to move quietly anymore. She turned to face the direction of the sound, her bear spray canister in her right hand, her flashlight in her left. "This is a federal ranger," she called out, her voice steady despite the terror climbing her spine. "You are trespassing on national forest land. Identify yourself immediately." A figure emerged from the undergrowth, and Diana's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The man was old. Incredibly old, his weathered face suggesting someone in their 70s or 80s. But his body moved with a predatory grace that seemed impossible for someone that age. His clothing was layered and mismatched, constructed from what appeared to be animal hides and forest debris. But it was his eyes that terrified Diana most. They weren't the eyes of someone living in isolation. They were intelligent, focused, and completely devoid of empathy. They were the eyes of someone who had made peace with doing things that civilized society considered monstrous. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice surprisingly clear and articulate despite the decades he'd apparently spent in the forest. "I gave warnings. I left signs. Everyone who comes here knows the consequences." Diana kept her bear spray trained on him, maintaining distance. "You need to come with me. You're under arrest for illegal habitation, unlicensed wildlife traps, and suspicion of—" She paused, unable to finish the sentence. "How did you accuse someone of murder when you had no bodies, no proof, just graves that might contain anything?" The man smiled. It was the worst thing that could have happened. The smile suggested he found her threat amusing, irrelevant, pathetic. "You think that spray will work on me? You think your radio will save you? I've been here longer than you've been alive. This forest knows me. It protects me. Every trail you think leads out actually leads deeper in. Every direction you run, you end up back here." Diana saw movement in the undergrowth behind him. More figures. At least 3 of them, maybe 4, emerging from the forest like ghosts. They had the same weathered appearance, the same predatory grace. But there was something else about them. Something that made Diana's skin crawl. They moved in perfect synchronization, their movements mirroring each other, their breathing synchronized. They looked like people, but they moved like something else. Something that had learned to imitate human movement, but hadn't quite perfected it. "These are my people," the old man continued, gesturing to the figures around him. "The ones who came into my territory and decided to stay. The ones who understood that civilization is a prison, and that real freedom means living by different rules. Rules that I made. Rules that they follow." Diana's professional detachment shattered completely. She fired a burst of bear spray directly at the old man's face, a 3-second discharge that should have incapacitated anyone. The spray hit him directly, coating his face, his eyes, his mouth. He didn't react. He didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his face drenched in the chemical irritant, his expression unchanged, his eyes still focused on Diana with absolute intensity. She ran. Pure panic overriding her training, her tactical thinking, her survival instincts redirecting into pure flight response. Behind her, she heard the coordinated movements of multiple people pursuing her, their footsteps perfectly synchronized, their breathing in unison. She crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at her uniform, her GPS unit bouncing on its lanyard. She had no idea where she was going, only that she needed distance, needed to escape, needed to find the forest road and get to her truck and get away from this place. The forest seemed to work against her. Trails she followed dead-ended in dense thickets. Paths that appeared clear from a distance became impassable tangles of vegetation. She turned left and found herself back where she'd started. She turned right and encountered a ravine that hadn't existed on her GPS coordinates. The pursuit behind her never faltered, never lost pace, always maintaining distance, as if they were herding her rather than chasing her, directing her movements through some territory they had mapped perfectly. Diana burst through a final thicket and found herself at the edge of a clearing. Her truck was parked there, exactly where she'd left it hours before. For a moment, hope surged through her. She could make it. She could get to the vehicle, get to her emergency radio, get help. She sprinted the final 100 yards to the truck bed, fumbled for her keys, got the driver's side door open. Behind her, the synchronized footsteps had stopped. She looked back and saw them standing at the edge of the clearing. The old man in front, the others arranged behind him in perfect formation. "Drive away," the old man called out, his voice carrying across the clearing with unnatural clarity. "Go ahead. Drive away and tell your superiors what you found. Tell them about the graves. Tell them about the traps. Tell them about us. See if anyone believes you. See if anyone comes back to help you." Diana didn't wait to hear more. She started the truck, threw it into drive, and accelerated away from the clearing. She didn't look back. She drove for what felt like hours, the forest road twisting and turning beneath her tires. When she finally emerged onto paved highway, her odometer showed she'd only driven approximately 8 miles. The clearing had been only 8 miles from the forest road access point. 8 miles inward, but the terrain she'd covered had felt like 40. She drove directly to the state police office in Eugene and filed a report. State Forest Service personnel were deployed the following day to investigate. They found the shelter, partially dismantled. They found several of the bear traps, though many had apparently been moved or destroyed. They found what appeared to be grave sites, but excavation revealed no bodies, just soil that had been disturbed and then carefully replaced. They found the photographs pinned to the interior walls, but Diana's photographs of them had vanished from her phone and camera. The digital files were simply gone, along with all the images she'd taken at the scene. The state concluded that the site had been abandoned, possibly decades ago, and suggested that Diana had likely encountered homeless individuals who had established an unauthorized camp. No charges were filed. No arrests were made. The shelter was deemed unsafe and destroyed by Forest Service crews. The area was placed under increased ranger patrols for the following month, but no unusual activity was ever reported. Diana completed her ranger certification, but requested a transfer to an urban park system. She submitted her resignation from the National Forest Service 6 months later, citing a desire to pursue other career opportunities. She refused all interviews about the incident and moved to Portland, where she works in city parks management to this day. But rangers who work the Umpqua National Forest Sector 7 report that the warnings have returned. New carvings have appeared on trees, written in different hands, different styles, but all bearing the same message. Stay out. Photographs of new rangers have been reported by hikers, images supposedly left on ranger station bulletin boards showing rangers in their homes, taken from impossible angles that suggest someone was very close to windows and walls at the moment the photographs were taken. And nobody has ever explained who the old man was, where he came from, or how he and his companions had managed to live undetected in the forest for what might have been several decades. Or what happened to the 12 people whose graves Diana Torres found marked in the forest floor. The research station's air filtration system had stopped working 3 hours ago, and Robert Kim couldn't remember why that mattered anymore. He was conducting environmental monitoring at the Mount Hood National Forest Research Facility, a remote station located at 4,200 feet elevation that served as a hub for long-term ecological studies. The October weather had turned unusual, warm for the season, humidity levels climbing despite the elevation and seasonal patterns. Robert had been assigned to the station for a 2-week rotation as part of his second-year ranger position, responsible for maintaining equipment, collecting samples, and documenting any unusual environmental phenomena. The facility was designed for 3 people, but budget cuts had left him staffing it alone. The isolation was supposed to be temporary. The research was supposed to be routine. The first sign that something was wrong came when Robert noticed the air smelled different. Sweet, cloying, almost floral, but with an underlying note of decay that made his stomach turn. He checked the environmental sensors, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, all reading normally. He checked the air quality monitors, and that's when the data became strange. Particulate matter had increased dramatically over the past 6 hours, with a composition that didn't match anything in the database. The particles were organic, possibly fungal in origin, and they were concentrated inside the research station itself rather than outside in the forest air. Robert conducted a visual inspection of the facility, moving through the main lab, the sample storage area, the generator room. That's when he saw them, the spores. They were visible as a faint shimmer in the air when he aimed his headlamp at specific angles, creating patterns of light refraction that suggested millions of microscopic particles suspended in the atmosphere. The spores seemed to have a faint luminescence, catching the light and reflecting it in colors that seemed to shift. Green one moment, blue the next. Then a shade that didn't have a name. They moved with air currents, creating visible streams of colored light that flowed through the research station like aurora borealis had somehow become trapped indoors. He immediately initiated emergency protocol, sealing the station's ventilation system and activating the backup air filtration units. The sweet smell persisted, seemingly growing stronger despite the sealed environment. Robert put on a respiratory mask, rated for biological particulates, and began documenting the phenomenon with his camera and environmental sensors. The spore concentration continued to increase. Within an hour, the concentration had tripled. Within 2 hours, it had tripled again. The colorful shimmer in the air had become visible even without a headlamp, creating an almost beautiful display that Robert found himself staring at, despite his scientific training screaming that something was very wrong. That's when the hallucination started. It was subtle at first, a sense that the walls were slightly closer than they should be, that the floor was tilting at angles that didn't quite make sense. Robert checked his instruments, and they showed normal readings. He knew the hallucinations were occurring, which meant either he was experiencing a neurological event or the spores were affecting his brain chemistry somehow. He documented his observations, noting the time, the symptoms, the concentration levels. His handwriting remained steady, his scientific mind compartmentalizing the experience even as his perceptions began fragmenting. By midnight, the distinction between hallucination and reality had become impossible to determine. Robert found himself having conversations with people who weren't there. His supervisor Leonidas, discussing research protocols, a colleague named Kaizen, debating the implications of the spore data. His mother, asking why he hadn't called in several days. The conversations felt completely real. He could see them, hear them, feel their presence in the research station. They responded to his questions with perfect contextual accuracy, saying things that only those people would know. But when he looked directly at them, they would flicker, becoming translucent, then solid again, their positions subtly wrong relative to the room's geometry. Robert's radio had been transmitting throughout the incident, though he couldn't remember making that decision. He was vaguely aware that someone was speaking back to him, his supervisor Leonidas, calling from the main ranger station, asking him to confirm his status, asking him to describe what he was experiencing. But Leonidas was also standing in the research station, right there next to him, looking concerned. Robert pointed at the Leonidas in the station and told the radio Leonidas that he was right here, everything was fine. The research was proceeding normally. The time markers on his documentation became unreliable. He wrote notes at what he believed was 1:47 a.m. But when he looked at the clock, it showed 6:32 p.m. He wrote another note at what felt like minutes later, and the clock showed 3:15 a.m. The spore concentration had reached levels that should have been lethal. But Robert felt fine. Better than fine. He felt expanded, as if his consciousness was extending beyond the boundaries of his skull, spreading through the research station and out into the forest beyond. He could feel the mycelium networks in the soil, could sense the vast underground structures that connected trees and plants through fungal highways. He could sense other minds, not human minds, but intelligences that existed in the spaces between biological functions, consciousnesses that had been growing in the forest for centuries, waiting for conditions to align. His supervisor's voice on the radio became increasingly desperate, asking Robert to confirm visual landmarks, to describe his immediate surroundings, to answer basic cognitive questions, to determine his mental status. Robert tried to comply, but the words that came out of his mouth didn't seem to belong to him. He described the research station walls as breathing, as pulsing with colors that didn't exist in normal perception. He described the floor as being covered in a living carpet of fungal growth that was beautiful and terrible and necessary. He described the spores not as particles, but as thoughts. Billions of thoughts floating through the air, each one carrying information, each one trying to enter his mind and make him understand something fundamental about the nature of the forest. Rescue personnel arrived at the research station at approximately 7 a.m., wearing full hazmat suits and carrying portable air filtration equipment. They found Robert in the main laboratory, standing at the center of the room, his respiratory mask removed, his eyes unfocused, his body swaying slightly, despite the absence of any air currents. He was speaking in a language that the rescue team couldn't identify. Not any recognized human language, but something that sounded like wind moving through hollow trees, mixed with the crackle of electrical discharge and the underwater sounds of whale song. His skin had a faint luminescence, and the air around him shimmered with the same colorful spore patterns that had been documented by the station sensors. The rescue team attempted to move Robert toward the exit, but his body seemed to resist in ways that weren't overtly violent, but were impossibly strong. It was as if he was being held in place by invisible forces, or as if he didn't want to leave. One of the rescue personnel reported that when they made physical contact with Robert, they began experiencing similar hallucinations, vivid, detailed perceptions of consciousness expanding, of communication with vast intelligences hidden in the forest. They withdrew from contact, sealed the research station, and called for additional support. The containment protocol initiated by the Forest Service was unprecedented in scope. Within 6 hours, the entire Mount Hood research facility was surrounded by a perimeter established at 200 yards in all directions. Hazmat teams in full protective gear established decontamination stations. The airspace above the facility was restricted to prevent any airborne particles from escaping into the broader atmosphere. Military-grade air filtration units were deployed to create a negative pressure environment around the research station, drawing air inward and filtering it through HEPA systems before exhausting it into the forest beyond the containment zone. Robert Kim remained inside the research station for 72 hours without intervention. During that time, his radio transmissions continued, though increasingly, they were not in any language that could be understood or translated. The sounds he made suggested communication. There were patterns, variations in tone and pitch that indicated deliberate meaning. But the content was utterly incomprehensible. Occasionally, words in English would emerge from the transmissions, fragments that suggested Robert was still capable of human speech but had chosen not to use it. "Beautiful," he transmitted at one point. "Finally understand, the forest is alive. It's all alive. Has been alive forever. We were just too small to see." Medical personnel established by the containment perimeter attempted to monitor Robert remotely through the research station's security camera system. What they observed defied medical explanation. Robert's body had developed a faint bioluminescence, similar to the spore patterns that continued to shimmer through the research station's interior. His skin had taken on a texture that appeared slightly granular, as if something was growing across his epidermis. His movements had become fluid, almost boneless, as if his skeletal structure had somehow become more flexible. He spent hours standing motionless, then would suddenly move with unsettling speed, and then would become still again. He wasn't eating. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't maintaining any of the basic functions that would suggest he was still operating as a human organism should operate. The spore concentration inside the research station reached astronomical levels. The environmental sensors finally failed, unable to process data that exceeded their maximum measurement capacity. Visual observation through the windows showed the interior had become almost entirely obscured by the shimmer of suspended spores, creating a medium that was something between air and liquid. The colorful aurora-like patterns had intensified, now filling the entire interior of the building with shifting iridescence that pulsed in rhythms that seemed almost biological, almost like breathing. On the morning of day 4, something changed. The spore concentration inside the research station began to decrease, not dramatically, but measurably. The shimmer in the windows began to fade. The luminescence diminished, and Robert Kim appeared at the front door of the research station, stepping outside into the morning light with movements that were almost normal, almost human. He was walking carefully, as if relearning how human locomotion worked. But he was walking. The hazmat teams responded immediately, surrounding him at safe distance, their equipment ready for any contingency. Robert didn't resist. He stood in the center of the containment zone, his skin still showing faint bioluminescence, his movements still slightly uncoordinated, but his expression aware. When he spoke, his voice was Robert's voice, but there was something layered beneath it, an echo or harmonics, as if multiple voices were speaking in perfect unison, creating the illusion of a single speaker. "I understand now," Robert said, his words directed at no one in particular. "The spores aren't an infection. They're communication. The forest has a way of sharing information through the air, through the water, through the mycelium networks beneath the soil. When I was inside that concentration, I was part of the network. I could understand what the forest has been trying to tell us for centuries. The trees aren't individual organisms. They're nodes in a vast intelligence. The forest itself is conscious. It has been conscious for longer than human civilization has existed. The containment team attempted to question him further, but Robert's responses became increasingly incoherent, cycling between English and those strange vocalizations that seemed to carry meaning despite being incomprehensible to human ears. His body temperature was measured at 94 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. His heart rate was dangerously elevated, 120 beats per minute and climbing, despite his apparent calm. His pupils had dilated to full black, and occasional flickers of bioluminescence continued to play across his skin like distant lightning. Medical intervention was attempted. Paramedics attempted to start an IV line, but Robert's blood had taken on an unusual consistency, slightly viscous, with a faint iridescence similar to the spores. Standard blood analysis equipment couldn't process the samples. The cellular structure appeared altered, with what looked like fungal elements integrated into the blood cells themselves. Robert's white blood cell count was dangerously elevated, but microscopic analysis suggested the cells were engaged in some kind of symbiosis rather than fighting an infection. Robert was transported to a secure medical facility in Portland, where he was placed in an isolation ward and subjected to continuous medical monitoring. His condition stabilized over the following week, though stabilized was a generous term for what was occurring. His body temperature remained subnormal. His consciousness seemed to fluctuate between lucidity and something else, states in which he appeared to be receiving information through sensory organs that didn't correspond to any standard human sensory apparatus. He would occasionally gesture toward walls, speaking in that strange language as if responding to communication that nobody else could perceive. Biopsies taken from Robert's skin revealed the presence of fungal structures integrated throughout his dermal and epidermal layers. The structures weren't causing tissue damage or immune response. They appeared to be coexisting in some kind of mutualistic relationship with his human cells. Analysis of his cerebrospinal fluid showed similar integration at the neurological level. Fungal mycelium had established itself within his brain tissue, creating networks that appeared to run parallel to his neural structures. The medical team couldn't determine if this was causing Robert's altered mental state or enabling some form of expanded consciousness. Robert's parents requested he be released to their care after 3 weeks of hospitalization. Despite the recommendations of the medical team for continued observation, Robert was deemed stable enough to discharge. He walked out of the Portland Medical Center moving with the fluid grace that had first appeared in the research station, his skin still bearing faint traces of bioluminescence under certain lighting conditions, his eyes still reflecting light like an animal's eyes reflect the beam of a flashlight. He lives in a small house in rural Oregon now, maintaining minimal contact with the outside world. He works remotely doing data analysis for a research firm, communicating primarily through email and occasional phone calls. Those who have spoken with him in person report that he seems almost normal. But there's something fundamentally changed about his perception of reality. He speaks about the forest with reverence and understanding. That suggests he's receiving information from sources beyond human knowledge. He describes the mycelium networks as a global internet that has existed for millions of years, predating human civilization. He claims that the fungal bloom at the Mount Hood Research Facility wasn't an infection or an invasion. It was a deliberate attempt at communication, a reaching out from a vast intelligence that had been trying to establish connection with human consciousness. The Mount Hood Research Facility was decontaminated and reopened 6 months later, with enhanced air filtration systems and mandatory hazmat protocols for any researcher working in the facility. No new incidents have occurred. The environmental anomaly that preceded Robert's contamination has never been fully explained. Mycological analysis of samples collected from the research station identified dozens of fungal species, several of which are new to science, but none that match the characteristics of the spore particles that were initially observed. The spore patterns in Robert's original documentation remain unidentified. The medical records documenting his condition and recovery have been classified under national security protocols, with access restricted to specific government agencies and research institutions with appropriate clearances. Robert Kim has been contacted multiple times by researchers and medical professionals requesting interviews or additional testing. He has declined all requests. He has, however, been observed making regular trips into the Hoh National Forest at night, carrying recording equipment and notebooks. Local rangers report finding areas of unusual fungal growth in the regions where Robert has been documented, patterns that suggest intentional cultivation rather than natural occurrence. When questioned about these activities, Robert simply states that he's conducting personal research and that the forest is very interested in establishing more direct communication channels with humans who are willing to listen. The question that remains unanswered is whether the fungal bloom at the Hoh Research Facility was a natural occurrence, a controlled experiment by some unknown agency, or an intentional act of communication by something vast and ancient that exists in the spaces between the trees, in the networks beneath the soil, in the spores that drift on wind currents through the Pacific Northwest forests. Something that has been waiting for human consciousness to evolve to the point where genuine conversation might finally become possible. Catherine Hayes could see the tree falling before she heard it, the massive Douglas fir toppling in slow motion against the black sky, as if the wind had decided it was time. She was conducting storm damage assessment in the Umpqua National Forest, Washington, during what meteorologists were calling a once-in-a-decade windstorm. Wind speeds had exceeded 100 miles per hour for the past 8 hours, and Catherine had been deployed to document the damage corridor, assess forest health, and compile data for the post-storm recovery effort. It was 2:47 a.m. when the anemometer mounted on her vehicle recorded a gust of 127 miles per hour, and the forest around her had transformed into something barely recognizable. The rain was horizontal, driving so hard it felt like gravel hitting her windshield. Trees were snapping like toothpicks, their massive trunks fracturing at the base or splintering midway up their height. Catherine had been a ranger for 11 years, and she'd worked through severe weather events before. But nothing had prepared her for this level of atmospheric violence. Her supervisor had authorized her to proceed with the damage assessment despite the ongoing storm conditions, because the data needed to be collected in real time, before the extent of the damage could be fully appreciated in daylight. Catherine's vehicle was equipped with specialized equipment for extreme weather documentation: anemometers, barometric pressure sensors, photographic equipment with stabilization systems designed to function despite environmental chaos. She was parked at a scenic overlook that provided a vantage point over approximately 200 acres of forest, her vehicle positioned perpendicular to the dominant wind direction to minimize wind load on the structure. That's when Catherine noticed something wrong with the damage pattern. The trees weren't falling randomly. They were falling in specific patterns, a corridor of destruction that ran roughly northeast through the forest, approximately 200 yards wide, with trees on either side of the corridor remaining relatively intact. Within the corridor itself, the destruction was systematic. Trees fell directionally, almost as if something was moving through the forest and deliberately toppling the trees in its path. Catherine documented the pattern with her camera, capturing long exposure photographs that showed the trajectory of falling trees, the spray of splinters, the moment of impact. The pattern became clearer with each image she reviewed. Something was moving through that forest, and it was leaving a trail of destruction as it moved. She stepped out of her vehicle to get a better angle on the damaged corridor, bracing herself against the wind, her rain gear immediately soaked through by the horizontal precipitation. Her anemometer was screaming data. Wind speeds that were fluctuating in ways that didn't match normal storm dynamics. The wind would spike to over 130 miles per hour, specific areas, then drop to 85 miles per hour just yards away, creating pockets of relative calm separated by zones of extreme violence. Catherine's professional mind recognized this as impossible. Wind didn't behave this way. Wind patterns didn't create localized corridors of extreme violence separated by areas of comparative calm, unless something was disrupting the wind flow, channeling it, directing it through specific pathways. The anemometer reading spiked to 147 miles per hour. Catherine watched in real time as a section of forest approximately 300 yards distant erupted into chaos. Not gradual toppling, but simultaneous destruction. A massive area of forest simply collapsed inward, trees falling in a radial pattern as if something massive was moving upward through them. The sound was catastrophic. The cracking of wood, the shriek of wind accelerating through the void created by the falling trees. Something else underneath it all. A deep rumbling that Catherine felt through her boots, through the metal frame of her vehicle, through her bones. She grabbed her radio to report the phenomenon, but her transmission was cut off by static that had a rhythm to it, a pattern that almost sounded like something breathing. Catherine returned to her vehicle, her hands shaking, her training fractured by what she was witnessing. She was supposed to document damage, not investigate phenomenon. But her curiosity and her need to understand what she was seeing overcame her caution. She started the vehicle and drove slowly along the forest road that paralleled the damaged corridor, keeping her lights fixed on the line of destruction. The pattern continued for another half-mile, systematic, directional, following a path that suggested purposeful movement. Then the pattern stopped. The trees simply resumed their random falling, their destruction no longer forming that neat corridor of devastation. Catherine waited, idling her vehicle, watching the forest through the chaos of wind and rain. The damage corridor had lasted approximately 1 mile through the forest before stopping. Whatever had been causing it was gone now, or had stopped moving. She documented the endpoint of the corridor, photographed the transition zone where the systematic destruction gave way to random wind damage, and recorded her observations into her field log. Her voice was steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Observed unusual damage pattern suggesting possible directed force through Forest Sector 4. Pattern began at coordinates. She read off the GPS numbers, then stopped recording. That's when she heard the sound. It came from directly above her vehicle, a massive shape moving through the air, something that created a pressure wave so intense it rocked her truck on its suspension. Catherine's headlights swept upward toward the sound, but caught nothing. No helicopter, no aircraft. Just the violent thrashing of trees being pushed by wind that seemed to be coming from a specific source, rather than a general direction. The sound moved across her position from left to right, tracking parallel to her vehicle, maintaining distance of maybe 20 yards from her position. Catherine could feel it more than see it. A sense of massive size, of controlled movement despite the storm chaos, of something intelligent directing the wind like a weapon. She hit the accelerator, her vehicle lurching forward along the forest road. Behind her, the canopy erupted into destruction. Trees fell in a pattern that followed her movement, as if something was tracking her, herding her, testing her response. Catherine drove faster, abandoning any pretense of careful assessment. The destruction behind her continued to follow, maintaining distance, but following her trajectory exactly. She was being pursued, hunted. Something was using the storm as cover, using the wind as a weapon, and it was following her with terrifying precision. Catherine's vehicle skidded on the wet forest road as she took a sharp left turn, attempting to break the pattern of pursuit. The sound above her shifted direction instantly, tracking her new heading with terrifying precision. Her headlights swept across the forest ahead, and she saw the road narrowing, visibility degrading as the canopy pressed lower. The wind was now screaming at frequencies that hurt her ears, creating pressure waves inside the vehicle that made her chest ache. Her anemometer was no longer recording data. The wind speeds had exceeded its maximum measurement capacity of 200 miles per hour. The sensor was simply maxing out, unable to quantify the violence surrounding her. The forest road opened into a wider section, a clear-cut area from logging operations conducted decades earlier. Catherine gunned the accelerator, racing across the open ground where there were fewer trees to fall, fewer obstacles to navigate. Behind her, the destruction continued to follow. She could see it now in her rearview mirror, a massive disturbance in the canopy at the forest's edge, trees toppling inward as if something was pushing through them with tremendous force. But there was nothing visible. No shape, no form. Just the systematic destruction of the forest, directed by something she couldn't see. The sound changed. What had been a sustained roar of wind and snapping wood transformed into something else. A deep, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate through the metal of her vehicle. Catherine's teeth ached from the vibration. Her vision blurred. The frequency was so intense that her instruments began to malfunction. The radio cycling through static and fragments of transmission, the GPS display flickering wildly, her dashboard lights dimming and brightening erratically. The pressure wave hit her vehicle broadside, lifting it slightly off the ground, threatening to flip it onto its side. Catherine fought the steering wheel, her hands slipping on the wet grip, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it over the roar of the engine. She made a decision born of desperation. She aimed her vehicle directly at the forest wall ahead and accelerated. If something was pursuing her through the forest, then she would leave the forest entirely. Catherine's truck crashed through the understory at 70 miles per hour, branches shattering against the windshield, the vehicle pitching and heaving over the uneven terrain. Behind her, she heard the sound change. A shriek that seemed almost surprised, as if whatever was pursuing her hadn't anticipated this direction of escape. She burst through the final barrier of trees and suddenly found herself on the edge of a steep slope. Catherine had a fraction of a second to register the reality of her situation before the vehicle went over the edge. The truck tumbled down the slope, gravity accelerating it through a series of increasingly violent impacts. Catherine was thrown against the restraint of her seatbelt, her head snapping repeatedly against the side window, stars exploding in her vision with each impact. The vehicle rolled at least 3 times before coming to rest against a massive fallen log at the bottom of the ravine. Catherine hung suspended by her seatbelt, her body aching, blood running down her face from a gash on her forehead. She hung there in the darkness, gasping, unable to move, unable to think beyond the immediate moment. The wind had stopped. Not gradually died down, but simply stopped. The howling ceased. The pressure waves ceased. The destruction ceased. Catherine dangled in absolute silence, listening to the tick of her cooling engine, the drip of fluid leaking from damaged hoses. She waited for several minutes, barely daring to breathe, expecting the onslaught to resume at any moment. But the forest remained still. The storm had moved on. Whatever had been pursuing her had apparently abandoned the chase once she left the forest. Catherine managed to unbuckle herself from the seatbelt and drop into the cab of the overturned truck. The cab was crushed on one side, and she had to squeeze through the passenger side window to exit. Her entire body screamed in protest, Ribs possibly fractured, shoulder dislocated or severely sprained, multiple lacerations bleeding steadily. She climbed out of the ravine slowly, painfully, using fallen trees and rocks to pull herself upward. The forest around her was in chaos. Trees down everywhere, massive areas of cleared canopy, the landscape transformed into something barely recognizable. She reached the forest road after nearly an hour of agonizing effort. Her emergency radio was damaged, but she managed to activate the emergency beacon, a last resort signaling device that would alert search and rescue to her position. She sat on the muddy road, shaking uncontrollably, and waited for help to arrive. The storm was moving away now, the wind dropping to manageable levels, the rain beginning to ease. The anemometer reading dropped steadily as Catherine sat in the darkness, from 100 miles per hour to 80 to 60 to 40. Within 2 hours, the wind had dropped to normal storm levels. By dawn, the storm had moved entirely out of the region. Search and rescue located Catherine at approximately 7:30 a.m. She was transported to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle with injuries consistent with a severe vehicle accident. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, severe contusions. She underwent emergency surgery and spent 12 days in the intensive care unit. She survived her injuries, but the experience had fundamentally altered her perception of the forest. She was discharged from the hospital and placed on medical leave for recovery. The damage assessment for the windstorm was completed by other rangers over the following weeks. The data was unusual, but not unprecedented. The storm had created a damage corridor approximately 1 mile long, with systematic destruction concentrated in a roughly 200-yard wide path through the forest. Meteorological analysis attributed this to a particularly powerful downdraft, a concentrated column of descending air that created localized areas of extreme wind velocity. It was an interesting anomaly, but nothing that contradicted established atmospheric science. The incident was documented and filed in the Forest Service records. Catherine did return to ranger duties after her recovery, but she requested assignment to administrative work rather than field operations. She eventually transferred to the Pacific Northwest Regional Office in Seattle, where she works in forest management planning. She refuses to discuss the details of her experience during the windstorm, and she has declined all requests for interviews about the incident. Those who have worked with her since the event report that she becomes visibly uncomfortable when severe weather is forecasted, and she monitors storm tracking with obsessive attention. The question that remains unanswered is whether the damage corridor Catherine observed was indeed caused by a natural atmospheric phenomenon, or whether something was moving through that forest on the night of the storm, something that had learned to manipulate wind patterns, to use the storm as camouflage, to direct destruction with apparent purpose and intelligence. The fact that the pursuit stopped the moment Catherine left the forest suggests either coincidence or that whatever was following her had a territorial boundary that it would not cross. Local rangers who work the Umpqua National Forest now report that damage patterns continue to appear sporadically after severe weather events. Always in similar corridors of systematic destruction, always moving through the forest in patterns that suggest purposeful movement rather than random wind damage. The National Weather Service has never been able to adequately explain why Catherine's vehicle was found in a ravine with damage that corresponded to falling from a height of 70 feet, or how she managed to climb out of that ravine with injuries severe enough to require emergency surgery, or why the Forest Service documentation shows that no vehicles had been reported missing in the area where Catherine was rescued. Despite the fact that her truck was never recovered and remains unaccounted for in any official records. Michael Reeves heard his own voice on the emergency channel, and he knew he was either hallucinating or something fundamental about reality had fractured. He was conducting maintenance on the communication relay tower in the Pinchot National Forest, Washington, a remote installation that served as a critical hub for ranger communications across a 400-square-mile sector. The fog was so dense that he couldn't see more than 30 feet in any direction, and the temperature had dropped significantly since sunset. Unusual for late spring, creating conditions that felt more like early winter. Michael had been a ranger for 6 years, with specialized training in radio and communication systems, and he'd been assigned to repair a malfunction in the relay's primary transmitter. He'd hiked to the tower site carrying repair equipment, ascending through increasingly thick fog until the world had simply disappeared into white nothingness. The tower existed, visible only because he was standing directly against it. But the ground and sky had become indistinguishable. Michael was working on the transmitter housing when the voices began. At first, he thought they were feedback or a cross signal from another frequency. But as he listened more carefully, he recognized the voices. They were rangers, specific rangers, people he'd worked with, trained with, people whose voices he knew with intimate familiarity. But they were making distress calls, emergency transmissions, reports of situations that didn't match anything in current dispatch records. A ranger named Ayan was reporting a bear attack in Sector 9, a location that had been restricted and closed to ranger patrols for 3 years. A ranger named Elio was reporting hypothermia and disorientation in a location that Michael knew for a fact had been completely searched and cleared. A ranger named Trip was making a transmission about creatures in the forest. Something large and coordinated, moving through the trees in patterns that suggested organization. Michael stopped working on the transmitter and attempted to trace the source of the transmissions. His equipment showed the signals were coming from the relay tower itself, but not from the current functional equipment. The signals appeared to be originating from something beneath the ground, something connected to the tower's foundation through cabling that Michael didn't recognize. He examined the tower's base more carefully, clearing away the undergrowth and forest debris that had accumulated over years of neglect. He found cables running directly into the earth. Old cables, copper oxidized to a pale green, insulation cracked and deteriorated. The cables descended deep into the forest floor, disappearing into darkness that his headlamp couldn't penetrate. The voices continued. Each one was someone Michael recognized. Each one was reporting emergency situations. Each one sounded increasingly desperate, increasingly injured, increasingly lost. Michael keyed his radio to respond, to ask for clarification, to attempt to provide assistance. His transmission went out. But when he released the transmit button, he heard his own voice on the receive channel. Not his current transmission being echoed back. That was normal. But a transmission he had made hours earlier, a casual check-in with his supervisor, now being broadcast on the emergency channel. His voice was distorted, playing at slightly the wrong speed, creating an uncanny quality that made his skin crawl. Michael attempted to shut down the relay and leave the tower site. He knew something was wrong, something that exceeded normal technical malfunction. But the fog had intensified in the time he'd been working. Visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. His GPS showed his position clearly, but when he tried to navigate away from the tower, the terrain seemed to work against him. He walked in what his compass assured him was a straight line, but after 5 minutes of walking, he found himself back at the tower base. He tried again, this time walking in a different direction, and the same thing happened. After 3 attempts, Michael accepted the reality that he couldn't leave the tower site. The voices on the radio were becoming more insistent, more urgent. They were calling his name now. Michael Reeves, saying his name over and over, asking him to help, asking him to respond, asking him where he was. Michael recognized some of the voices from missing persons cases. Rangers who had disappeared from the Hoh National Forest over the past 5 years. Rory, who disappeared in 2019. Dream, who went missing in 2021. Lawrence, who vanished in 2020. All of them were on the radio now, all of them calling his name, all of them asking for help in voices that grew progressively weaker, progressively more desperate. Michael made the decision to go back to the relay tower and attempt to trace the source of the transmissions more thoroughly. The maintenance access door was supposed to be locked, but when he tried the handle, it opened easily. The interior of the tower was dark, his headlamp beam cutting through shadow to illuminate a space that seemed larger than the exterior dimensions should have allowed. The interior walls were covered in something. Paper, Michael realized. Hundreds of pages of paper, each one covered in handwriting. Transmission logs, emergency reports, call transcripts. All of them handwritten, all of them predating the digital logging systems that should have been in place. Michael pulled one of the pages from the wall and examined it. It was a transmission from 1987. A ranger reporting damage from a windstorm. The next page was from 1993. Another ranger reporting unusual animal behavior. The pages spanned decades. Some of the handwriting was identical across time periods, suggesting the same person had been writing these logs for years. Other handwriting was different, suggesting multiple people had contributed. But all the pages were yellowed. All the ink was faded. All the paper was brittle with age. This tower had been receiving and recording transmissions for decades beyond what any official documentation suggested. Michael descended deeper into the tower's interior, his headlamp beam illuminating more pages, more handwriting, more transmission logs stretching back through time. The pages covered every surface. Walls, floor, even the ceiling had papers adhered to it with what looked like old tape. The further down he descended, the older the papers became. He found logs from the 1970s, from the 1960s, from the 1950s. Each page documented ranger transmissions, emergency calls, distress signals. Each page was a record of someone calling for help, someone reporting something wrong, someone trying to communicate with the outside world from somewhere deep within the Umpqua National Forest. The radio on Michael's belt continued to broadcast the voices, but now they were broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously. Michael could hear them all at once. Dozens of voices layered over each other, a cacophony of emergency transmissions that created a sound like wind moving through a vast, hollow space. He attempted to turn off the radio, but it continued broadcasting regardless. He removed the battery, and the voices simply continued coming from the tower's communication equipment, broadcasting from the relay system itself. Michael found a door at the bottom of the tower's interior shaft, a door that shouldn't exist, leading to a space that shouldn't be accessible. The door was made of metal, old and oxidized, with a handle that was ice cold despite the relative warmth of the tower's interior. He pulled it open, and a rush of cold air emerged, so cold it created visible frost on his breath, so cold it made his eyes water. Beyond the door was a space that extended beneath the forest floor. A chamber. Underground. Impossible given the geography and geology of the area. Inside the chamber, Michael saw the source of the voices. Banks of old radio equipment, vacuum tube technology from the 1950s, transistor equipment from the 1960s and 1970s, gradually transitioning to more modern digital systems as time progressed. All of it was still operational. All of it was still receiving and broadcasting transmissions. But more disturbing than the equipment was what was surrounding it. Papers. Thousands of pages, all of them covered in the same handwriting, all of them transmission logs, all of them dated and catalogued meticulously. The dates on the oldest papers went back to 1952. Michael selected one of the papers at random from the earliest records. It was dated March 15, 1952. The transmission it documented was from a ranger named Thomas, reporting a malfunction in the relay tower at this same location. Thomas's final message was requesting assistance, expressing concern that something was wrong with the radio equipment, something that he couldn't quite understand. The next page in sequence was dated March 24, 1952. It was a transmission from the same ranger, now reporting that he was trapped, that the equipment was broadcasting his own voice back to him, that he couldn't leave the tower because the fog wouldn't allow it. The final page related to Ranger Thomas was dated April 3, 1952. It simply said, "Help me understand what's happening. I don't know how to leave. I don't know how to stop the voices." Michael pulled page after page from the historical records, moving forward through time. Each ranger's story was similar, but with different details. Each one reported being trapped at the tower. Each one reported their own voice being broadcast back to them. Each one eventually stopped transmitting entirely, usually after a period of 3 to 4 weeks. The handwriting of the transmission logs themselves was consistent, suggesting that someone, or something, was maintaining these records through decades. Someone or something was cataloging the experiences of every ranger who had come to the tower and encountered this phenomenon. The most recent transmission logs were recent indeed. Michael found papers dated just days ago. One was from a ranger named Alonzo, dated 3 days earlier. The transmission was brief. "I hear my own voice on all frequencies. I can't leave. The fog is getting thicker. I don't understand what's happening." Another, from a ranger named Moses, dated 2 days ago. "How many of us are here? I can hear so many voices now. They all sound familiar. They all sound like me." Michael's hands were shaking as he held these papers. He was looking at documentation of the disappearances. He was looking at the final messages of rangers who had come to the tower and never left. He was looking at evidence of something that had been occurring for 70 years, something that had been systematically documented, something that nobody outside the tower knew about. The radio on his belt crackled with his own voice, broadcasting a transmission he had made earlier that day, now being repeated on endless loop with his voice playing over itself, creating layers of sound that were almost musical, almost rhythmic. He attempted to leave the chamber, to escape from the underground room. But the door had sealed behind him. He could see it in the wall, but it no longer had a handle. It was seamlessly integrated into the metal surface, impossible to open. Michael turned back to the radio equipment, searching for some way to disable it, some way to stop the voices. He found a master power switch, a massive copper lever corroded with age, but still functional. He threw it. The equipment powered down. The voices stopped. Silence filled the chamber. Absolute, complete silence that was almost suffocating in its intensity. Michael stood in that silence for several minutes, catching his breath, trying to process what he'd discovered. Then he heard the knocking. 3 distinct taps on the metal door that no longer had a handle. 3 taps, then 3 more, then 3 more again. The pattern repeated, methodical and patient, as if whatever was on the other side of the door was simply announcing its presence. Michael ran. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. His professional training had completely evaporated, replaced by pure survival instinct. He scrambled up the interior shaft of the tower, tearing pages from the walls as he climbed, desperate to escape the chamber below. He reached the maintenance door and burst through it into the fogs above. The fog was still there, still dense, still limiting visibility to less than 10 feet. He ran in a direction that he hoped was away from the tower. Crashing through undergrowth, his hands bleeding from torn paper edges, his lungs burning from exertion and cold air. After what felt like hours of running, Michael emerged from the fog into clear air. He was on a ridge overlooking the forest, and he could see the tower behind him, its outline barely visible through the mist. His radio was still on his belt, and it was still broadcasting. But now, it was broadcasting every transmission Michael had ever made as a ranger. A complete archive of his communications, all playing simultaneously, all layered over each other, creating a wall of sound that was his own voice repeated endlessly. Michael staggered down the ridge and found the main forest road. A passing Park Service vehicle picked him up 3 hours later. He was suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration despite his exertion, as if the temperature and environmental conditions in the tower had left him fundamentally changed. He was taken to a medical facility and treated for exposure and acute psychological trauma. He spent 8 days in psychiatric observation, during which he was relatively coherent but insistent that the Forest Service investigate the tower immediately. A team was dispatched to the relay tower the following day. They found the exterior intact, the communication equipment functional and recently serviced. There was no underground chamber. There was no door leading beneath the forest floor. There were no pages of transmission logs covering the walls. The relay tower was exactly what it appeared to be. A 50-year-old communication facility in reasonable working condition, with no evidence of anything unusual. The Forest Service documented Michael's experience under psychological episode during maintenance assignment and filed it in his personnel record. Michael was medically discharged from the Forest Service 2 weeks later. He requested the discharge himself, stating that he was no longer comfortable working in forestry service. He moved to Portland and took a job with an electronics repair company, a position that kept him away from forests and radio equipment. He refuses to discuss the incident in detail and has declined all offers for interviews. Those who have worked with him in his current position report that he becomes visibly uncomfortable whenever radio communication is being used. And he has requested that all workplace communication be conducted exclusively through email and text-based systems. The radio that was on Michael's belt during the incident was collected as evidence by the Forest Service and stored in an evidence locker in the regional office. The radio disappeared from the locker 3 weeks after being stored. 2 other radios that had been stored near it also disappeared. Security footage of the locker room showed no one entering or leaving during the time window when the radios vanished. The disappearance was filed as a clerical error, and the case was closed. Rangers who work the Hoh National Forest now report that they hear transmissions from missing rangers on their emergency frequencies. Voices calling for help. Voices reporting situations that match documented disappearances from years past. New rangers are warned not to approach the relay tower during fog, and experienced rangers avoid the tower entirely when weather conditions reduce visibility. But communication relay maintenance still needs to be performed, and volunteers are becoming increasingly difficult to find as word spreads about what happened to Michael Reeves and to the rangers who came before him. Nobody has ever explained why the relay tower's communication systems continue to broadcast voices on frequencies that should be dead. Why those voices are consistently identified as rangers who disappeared decades ago. Or whether Michael's underground chamber actually existed or was some kind of shared hallucination induced by exposure to something at the tower site that nobody has yet been able to identify or understand. Lisa found the first elk at dawn, and she knew immediately that something catastrophic had occurred in the forest overnight. She was conducting a wildlife mortality investigation in the Umpqua National Forest, Oregon, responding to a report from a hiker who had observed unusual animal activity in a remote sector. The forest was unseasonably cold for late fall, with frost forming on vegetation despite the season and elevation being inconsistent with such conditions. Lisa had been a ranger for 9 years, specializing in wildlife management and disease assessment, and she'd investigated dozens of mortality events. But the scale of what she was discovering was unlike anything in her experience. The first elk was positioned in a small clearing, its body perfectly intact, showing no signs of predation or injury. No wounds, no bleeding, no apparent cause of death. It was simply dead, positioned as if it had lain down and stopped living. As Lisa expanded her search radius around the clearing, she found more elk. Dozens of them, then hundreds. They formed a perfect circle around a central point in the forest, their bodies arranged in concentric rings that suggested deliberate positioning rather than random distribution. The animals ranged from massive bulls to young calves, all of them in perfect physical condition except for one critical fact. They were all dead. None showed signs of disease. None showed signs of injury. None showed signs of predation. Their bodies were in various stages of decomposition, suggesting death spread across a period of days or possibly weeks. But the arrangement was too perfect, too geometric, to be coincidental. Lisa documented everything meticulously, taking photographs from multiple angles, recording GPS coordinates for each animal's position, collecting tissue samples for later analysis. The circle itself was massive, approximately 300 yards in diameter, with the bodies arranged in mathematical precision. The central point of the circle was marked by something else. A stone arrangement, roughly circular, with patterns carved into the rocks that resembled symbols, but didn't match any known indigenous markings or natural weathering patterns. As Lisa approached the center, her dog, a ranger-certified search and rescue animal that had accompanied her on the investigation, suddenly refused to proceed further. The dog began backing away, its ears flattened, its behavior suggesting fear or distress. Lisa had never seen her dog react this way to anything in the forest. She forced the dog forward, concerned about what it might be sensing. As they approached the stone circle, Lisa noticed something she'd missed from distance. The ground itself seemed different. The vegetation was withered and dead in a perfect circular pattern around the stone arrangement, creating a bare earth zone approximately 15 feet in diameter. The soil appeared desiccated despite the normal moisture levels of the forest floor. When Lisa knelt to examine it, she felt intense cold radiating from the earth, as if the ground temperature had dropped significantly below ambient conditions. Her breath began to fog visibly despite the relatively warm air, and her hands began to shake. Not from fear, but from a physical response to what felt like extreme cold emanating from the earth itself. That's when Lisa realized she was standing inside the circle. The bodies had arranged themselves, or had been arranged, in a pattern that created a perimeter around this central cold zone. Lisa looked up at the surrounding elk and understood with sickening clarity that they weren't simply positioned in a circle. They were facing inward, all of them. Every single elk in the arrangement had its head turned toward the center, toward the stone arrangement, toward the cold zone where Lisa was now standing. Their eyes were open. Their expressions suggested they had been aware, conscious, deliberately positioned to witness something or to be positioned for a reason before they died. Lisa's professional detachment began to fracture. She backed away from the center, moving quickly, her dog pressing against her legs in a show of distress and need for contact. She documented the phenomenon methodically, her hands shaking, her voice steady as she recorded field notes. She documented the circle dimensions, the approximate number of animals, the condition of the bodies, the stone arrangement. She documented her own physical responses. The cold radiating from the earth, the frost forming on her clothing despite the ambient temperature remaining stable. The sense of being observed despite the complete absence of anything living except the bodies themselves. Lisa finished her initial assessment and began the process of collecting samples and marking the site for further investigation. She was kneeling beside one of the elk, collecting tissue samples from an animal that had been dead for approximately 2 weeks based on decomposition stage, when she became aware of a presence behind her. Not sound, not movement, just a sense of something there, something observing her, something that had materialized in her blind spot. She turned slowly, her hand going to the bear spray on her belt, and found herself facing one of the elk from the circle. Except it was standing, its body positioned upright despite death and decomposition having made such posture impossible. Its head was turned to face her, its eyes open, its expression carrying something that looked almost like curiosity. The animal's body was visibly decaying, tissue hanging from bones, patches of fur falling away. But it was standing with impossible rigidity, maintained in an upright position by forces that had nothing to do with muscular function or living biology. Lisa screamed. Pure animal response. She ran. Her professional composure shattered completely, replaced by primal flight instinct. Behind her, she could hear movement. Not the movement of a living animal, but something worse. The sound of bones moving, of joints that shouldn't be functional moving with purpose. The grinding of vertebrae and cartilage. Multiple bodies shifting position with coordinated intention. She didn't look back. She ran through the forest, her dog running beside her, crashing through undergrowth and deadfall, desperate to escape the clearing and everything in it. Lisa ran for what felt like hours, though her watch indicated only 37 minutes had passed. The forest around her seemed to shift, to transform, the familiar terrain becoming unrecognizable. She passed trees she was certain she'd seen before, suggesting she was moving in circles. But her compass and GPS both insisted she was traveling in a straight line away from the graveyard. Behind her, the sounds continued. That horrible grinding of bone on bone, the creaking of dead joints being flexed by forces that should have been impossible. Multiple bodies, multiple elk. Moving through the forest with coordinated purpose, maintaining pace with her, never accelerating, never falling behind, as if whatever was animating them understood pursuit tactics. The forest eventually opened into a broader area, where hiking trails intersected, and Lisa saw the ranger station ahead. She pushed harder, her lungs burning, her legs barely functional from exhaustion. She reached the station and burst through the door, immediately keying her radio to report her position and request immediate backup. Her transmission was garbled, incoherent, her words overlapping in her desperation. The dispatcher on the other end asked her to repeat, to clarify her situation, to confirm her location. Before Lisa could respond, the sounds from the forest stopped. Absolute silence. The grinding, the movement, the coordinated pursuit, all of it ceased instantly. Lisa stood in the ranger station, breathing in ragged gasps, her dog pressed against her legs, both of them trembling. She waited for several minutes, listening for any indication that whatever had been pursuing her was still outside. Nothing. The forest had returned to normal ambient sound. The wind in the trees, the distant call of birds, the normal sounds of a living forest rather than the nightmare she'd been experiencing. Rangers arrived at the station within 2 hours. Lisa was in shock, conscious but barely functional, unable to articulate clearly what she'd experienced. She was transported to a medical facility and treated for acute psychological trauma and physical exhaustion. During her hospitalization, she was able to provide more detailed accounts of what she'd discovered. A team was immediately deployed to the location she'd identified in her field notes. What they found was approximately 40% of what Lisa had documented. The elk bodies were there, hundreds of them, arranged in the geometric circle she'd described. But the stone arrangement at the center was gone, completely gone. There was no evidence, that it had ever been present. The cold zone she described didn't exist. Soil temperatures were normal for the season and location. Most disturbing, the elk bodies showed signs of normal decomposition consistent with deaths occurring over several weeks or months. There were no bodies in the state of advanced decay Lisa had described observing. The animals' eyes were open, which was consistent with certain decomposition patterns. But their positioning was explained as natural settling rather than deliberate arrangement. The tissue samples Lisa had collected were analyzed. The results indicated the elk had died from what appeared to be starvation. Their stomachs were completely empty, their body composition showing evidence of extended malnutrition despite the forest having adequate forage. But the timeline didn't make sense. The condition of the bodies suggested deaths spanning weeks or months. But the vegetation patterns and ecological indicators suggested the elk had died much more recently, within the past few days. The analysis was inconclusive. The cause of death remained undetermined. Lisa was released from medical care after a week of observation. She requested a transfer to administrative duties and was reassigned to the regional office in Portland. She no longer conducts field work, and she has declined all requests to return to the graveyard site for follow-up investigation. She maintains that what she experienced was real, but she acknowledges that some aspects of the encounter cannot be verified or explained. She refuses to discuss the details of what happened after she fled the clearing. But rangers who have subsequently worked in the sector of the Umpqua National Forest, where the elk graveyard was located, report ongoing anomalies. During autumn months, when elk populations are typically most active and visible, the sector shows dramatically reduced animal populations. Hunters who enter the area report seeing elk but finding it impossible to get close enough to attempt harvests. The animals seem to possess an awareness that borders on supernatural. They move with apparent knowledge of hunter positions before the hunters have revealed themselves. Game camera footage from the area shows numerous images of elk arranged in geometric patterns. Images captured over the course of multiple seasons and multiple camera installations. The cameras are typically disabled within days of being installed, with no clear explanation for the malfunction. Most disturbingly, park rangers report observations of what they describe as geometric patterns in the forest vegetation during fall months. Areas where plants appear to have been deliberately arranged or influenced to grow in specific patterns. Circles, concentric rings, symbols that don't correspond to any known language or marking system. The patterns are most visible during certain lighting conditions, early morning light or late afternoon light, and they often contain arrangements of dead animals positioned with apparent intentionality. Lisa Chen continues to work in the regional office, and she has become something of an unofficial expert on the Umpqua sector anomalies. She maintains detailed records of reports from rangers who have worked in the area, documenting patterns and attempting to establish some coherent explanation for what is occurring. She has theorized that the geometric arrangements might represent some form of animal communication system, that the patterns might be ritualistic behaviors tied to predator-prey relationships or territorial marking. But her theories are speculative and lack supporting evidence. The scientific explanation remains unsatisfactory. During interviews years later, Lisa acknowledged something she had never fully disclosed in official reports. When she fled the graveyard, she felt a compulsion to remain. Not fear driving her away, but a counter-impulse to stay, to join the circle, to lie down among the arranged elk and become part of the geometric pattern. She ran because her conscious mind overrode that impulse, because some survival instinct forced her to flee. But the pull to return, to complete whatever process had been interrupted when she escaped, has never fully left her. She experiences it most acutely during autumn months, when she finds herself driving toward the forest, toward the sector where the graveyard was located, before consciously redirecting her vehicle away from the area. Nobody has ever explained why an entire herd of elk would deliberately starve themselves to death in a geometrically perfect arrangement, or why subsequent investigations found evidence of the phenomenon continuing despite it never being adequately explained, or why Lisa Chen continues to experience what she describes as a psychological pull toward the location. A sensation that suggests something in the forest is calling to her, inviting her to return, promising her understanding if she would simply return to the graveyard and complete whatever process was interrupted when she ran. The Umpqua National Forest sector remains open to the public and available for ranger patrols. However, the frequency of reports of personnel requesting reassignment from the sector has increased steadily over the years. Current policy limits ranger assignments to the area to 2-week maximum rotations, with mandatory psychological evaluation following each assignment. The evaluations have consistently shown that rangers assigned to the sector report experiencing what they describe as persistent psychological intrusion, unwanted thoughts about returning to the forest, dreams about geometric patterns, a sense of being observed or called during their time off-site. The phenomenon has never been adequately explained. The elk graveyard continues to exist, continues to attract dead animals, and continues to arrange them in patterns that suggest intelligence and purpose. And Lisa Chen, who was the first to truly understand the scope and nature of what is occurring in that remote sector of the Umpqua National Forest, continues to fight the compulsion that draws her toward it, continues to acknowledge that part of her wants to return, to surrender to whatever is orchestrating the arrangement of the dead, to finally understand what the geometric patterns are trying to communicate. Thomas Wright's GPS showed him walking in a straight line, but the landmarks kept appearing behind him instead of ahead. He was conducting a lost hiker search and rescue operation in the Willamette National Forest, Oregon, following GPS coordinates provided by the missing persons emergency beacon. The operation had begun at dawn, and Thomas had been tracking the signal through increasingly difficult terrain for 6 hours. The weather was unseasonably warm despite early summer, creating an oppressive humidity that seemed to thicken the air itself. Thomas had been a ranger for 4 years, with specialized training in wilderness search and rescue, and he'd successfully located 16 missing persons over his career. The beacon signal was strong and consistent, suggesting the hiker was stationary, possibly injured. But something about the landscape felt wrong. The vegetation patterns, the elevation changes, the way the forest seemed to shift subtly with each step forward. Thomas had crossed what he was certain was the same creek 3 times in the past hour, each time from a different direction. His GPS insisted that each creek crossing was in a different location, miles apart from the previous crossings. But the creek was identical. Same width, same water clarity, same distinctive pattern of moss-covered rocks visible through the clear water. Thomas documented the anomaly in his field notes, flagging it for later analysis, and continued following the GPS beacon. The beacon was close now, maybe 2 kilometers away according to his unit. But the terrain was becoming increasingly difficult. Slopes that seemed to pitch at impossible angles, vegetation so dense it was barely penetrable, a sense of spatial distortion that made it difficult to judge distance or direction. That's when Thomas realized the trail markers were following him. He'd been marking his path through the dense forest with standard survey tape, bright orange ribbons tied to trees at regular intervals to establish a clear route back to the starting point. But when he turned to check his progress, he saw the markers appearing ahead of him instead of behind him. The markers he'd placed hours earlier were now positioned in front of his current location, strung along a path that seemed to be leading him deeper into the forest. Thomas checked his GPS again. The unit showed him stationary, standing in the same location he'd been at 5 minutes earlier, despite having walked continuously. Thomas stopped moving and examined his surroundings more carefully. The forest immediately around him showed signs of having been traversed recently. Broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, footprints in the soft earth. But the footprints were his own footprints, he realized. He was seeing evidence of his own passage, but arranged in ways that suggested he'd been walking in circles, arriving at the same locations from different directions, creating a pattern that didn't correspond to the linear path his GPS was insisting he'd traveled. The beacon signal remained constant, still indicating the missing hiker was approximately 2 kilometers away. But the terrain between his current position and the beacon's location seemed to be restructuring itself, creating barriers where none should exist, closing pathways that had been open moments before. Thomas made the decision to abandon the GPS-guided approach and instead navigate using traditional methods: compass bearing, visual landmarks, manual triangulation. He selected 3 distant peaks, visible through gaps in the canopy, and calculated a bearing that would take him toward the beacon's general location. He began hiking on that bearing, maintaining his direction with the compass, ignoring what the GPS unit was telling him about his position. But within 20 minutes, the 3 peaks he'd selected as landmarks had somehow shifted position. They were now in different locations relative to where he should be standing. The mountain that should have been due north was now northeast. The peak that should have been east was now north. Thomas checked his compass. It was functioning normally, but the landscape had somehow rotated around him. He attempted to establish radio contact with his supervisor to report the anomalies, but his transmissions weren't being received. His radio was functioning. He could hear the static, could hear the carrier wave engaged, but his voice wasn't being transmitted. He tried multiple frequencies, multiple times, and received only silence in response. His backup radio, a secondary unit all rescue rangers carried, functioned identically. Transmit button pressed, but no voice transmission being broadcast. He was completely isolated, unable to call for support, unable to report his position or the phenomenon he was experiencing. That's when Thomas noticed the footprints in the undergrowth. His footprints. Dozens of them, crisscrossing the terrain around him in patterns that suggested someone had walked the same area repeatedly, arriving and departing from multiple directions. But the footprints were all fresh. All of them showed recent disturbance of the leaf litter and forest floor. Thomas knelt to examine them more closely, and his stomach tightened as he realized the implications. These were his footprints, his boots, his distinctive tread pattern. But they indicated he'd been walking this same patch of forest for much longer than the 6 hours he'd actually been in the area. The accumulation of footprint evidence suggested days of walking, possibly weeks. Thomas began to run, panic overriding training, fear overriding procedure. He crashed through the undergrowth without regard for direction, without consulting his compass or GPS, simply moving away from the horrifying implications of what he'd discovered. Behind him, he could hear something that made his blood freeze. The sound of footsteps matching his pace. Not pursuing him aggressively, but maintaining distance, following his trajectory exactly. And the footsteps sounded like his own footsteps, the same boot tread pattern, the same cadence, the same rhythm. It was as if his own footprints were becoming animated, were pursuing him through the forest, were manifesting his physical presence behind him. Tongass ran for what felt like hours, though his watch showed only 43 minutes had elapsed. Time seemed to be functioning differently in this sector of the forest. His perception of duration didn't match the actual passage of time recorded by his chronometer. The footsteps behind him continued to match his pace perfectly. When he accelerated, they accelerated. When he slowed, they slowed. The synchronized cadence never wavered, never faltered, as if whoever or whatever was making those footprints understood his movements with perfect precision, anticipated his changes in direction, matched his every action with uncanny accuracy. Tongass burst through a thicket and suddenly found himself on a hiking trail, an actual established trail with a trail marker sign and clear path cutting through the forest. His rational mind seized on this as salvation. Established trails led to established locations. Established locations had ranger stations or trailheads where he could access emergency communication. He sprinted along the trail, his boots pounding on the packed earth, his lungs burning from exertion. Behind him, the matching footsteps also accelerated, still maintaining that perfect synchronization, still never falling behind or pulling ahead. The trail curved, descended into a valley, then climbed toward a ridge. Tongass recognized the topography. This was the trail leading back toward the trailhead where he'd begun his search. Relief flooded through him. He was only about 3 kilometers from the trailhead, which meant approximately 45 minutes of running. He could make it. He could escape this nightmare landscape and reach safety and human contact and rational explanation. His hope lasted approximately 90 seconds. The trail ended. Simply ended. What should have been a continuous path forward became a wall of vegetation so dense it was impenetrable. Tongass knew that wasn't possible. This was an established trail that received regular maintenance. It couldn't simply terminate. He turned around to backtrack and found that the trail behind him was also gone. The path he'd just run on had simply ceased to exist. He was surrounded by unbroken forest, the trail vanishing in both directions despite the fact that he'd only been on it for minutes. The footsteps stopped. Absolute silence replaced the synchronized rhythm of matching boots on packed earth. Tongass stood perfectly still, listening to the forest around him, aware that the cessation of the pursuing footsteps was somehow more terrifying than their continued presence. He was no longer being followed. He was no longer being tracked. Whatever had been maintaining that perfect synchronization with his movement had stopped. But that didn't mean he was safe. It meant the pursuit had ended for a reason, and Tongass's survival instinct screamed that the reason was something worse than a relentless chase. He heard the voice. It came from directly behind him, speaking in a tone that was achingly familiar. It was his voice, his exact vocal patterns, his accent, his speech cadence. Tongass, stop running. You've been running for so long. Don't you want to understand what's happening? Tongass spun around, his bear spray canister in his hand, ready to deploy. There was nothing there. The forest was empty. But the voice continued, now coming from a different direction, still using his exact vocal patterns. I'm tired of running too. I've been running for so long. I don't remember why I started. I don't remember where I'm trying to go. But I know I'm tired. Tongass backed away slowly. His spray canister extended, his training fragmenting under the weight of psychological horror. The voice spoke again, this time from multiple directions simultaneously, creating the illusion that dozens of Tongass Rights were surrounding him, all speaking in perfect unison. We've been walking in circles for so long. We've been trying to find the hiker. We've been trying to complete the rescue. But we keep arriving at the same place. We keep finding ourselves walking our own footprints. We keep hearing ourselves behind us. Tongass ran again. He abandoned all pretense of strategy or navigation and simply moved away from the voice, away from the multiplied echoes of his own vocal patterns, away from the horror of hearing himself speaking from invisible sources all around him. The forest began to shift as he ran. The terrain changed. The elevation altered. The vegetation transformed from dense undergrowth to open canopy to dense again in patterns that defied geographic logic. He was moving through a landscape that was actively restructuring itself around him, that was responding to his movement by reforming, reshaping, repositioning its features to maintain his disorientation. After what felt like an eternity of running, Tongass emerged into a clearing he recognized immediately. The search and rescue base camp. His vehicle was there. His supervisor's vehicle was there. But something was wrong. The camp was abandoned. His tent was still pitched, but it had been set up weeks ago based on the weathering and decay of the canvas. His equipment was scattered around the site, showing signs of having been disturbed repeatedly and then abandoned. His logbook lay open on the camp table, and when Tongass approached it, he saw pages of handwriting. His handwriting, documenting daily entries spanning 3 weeks. He had no memory of those 3 weeks. He knew he'd been in the forest for approximately 1 day. But his own handwriting, in his own logbook, documented 21 days of search operations. Entries describing the same phenomena, the GPS, malfunctions, the footprints appearing ahead instead of behind, the trail markers positioning themselves in wrong locations, the disorientation and temporal distortion. The entries grew progressively less coherent as they advanced through the 3-week period. By the final entry, the handwriting had become almost illegible, the words fragmenting into incoherence, the last line reading simply, "I don't remember why I'm here. I don't remember who I'm looking for. I only remember running." Tongass found his supervisor's vehicle keys in his own pocket. He had no memory of obtaining them. He drove the vehicle directly back toward the ranger station, refusing to stop, refusing to look at anything except the road ahead. The drive should have taken approximately 1 hour. It took 18 minutes. When he arrived at the ranger station, he immediately reported the incident and requested medical evaluation. His supervisor was shocked to see him. Tongass had been missing for 4 weeks. The search and rescue operation for Tongass himself had been launched 3.5 weeks into his disappearance when he failed to report in. Search teams had found his base camp and his initial equipment, but could find no trace of Tongass himself. The case had been moved to the state police as a potential missing person or recovery operation. Tongass's appearance at the ranger station was considered miraculous. A ranger returning from the dead with no memory of the time that had passed. Medical examination revealed no physical evidence of the trauma Tongass should have experienced during 4 weeks of exposure to wilderness conditions. His body weight was normal. His physical conditioning was unchanged. His health indicators were consistent with someone who had been living normally, not experiencing deprivation or stress. But his psychological evaluations revealed significant trauma. Post-traumatic stress indicators off the scale, dissociation, fragmented memory patterns, difficulty distinguishing between experienced events and imagined events. Tongass underwent psychiatric evaluation and was ultimately discharged from ranger service due to the severity of his psychological condition. He maintains that he was in the forest for only 1 day. and that the entries in his logbook were written by someone else using his handwriting, or were written by some version of himself that exists in a different temporal framework than his conscious experience. He refuses to return to the Willamette National Forest and becomes visibly distressed whenever the search and rescue operation is mentioned. He lives in Salem, Oregon currently, working in administrative support for the State Corrections Department, a position that keeps him permanently out of wilderness environments. The search and rescue beacon that had originally triggered the operation was never located. The missing hiker who had activated the beacon was never found. The case remains open, with periodic search operations still being conducted in the sector where Tongass became lost. Searchers report that the area shows unusual topographic features, trails that appear and disappear, landmarks that shift position between seasons, GPS units that malfunction in the sector despite functioning normally in surrounding areas. Park rangers have been instructed to avoid conducting solo operations in the sector, and all rescue operations in the area now require minimum teams of 3 rangers with mandatory psychological evaluation following each assignment. The phenomenon Tongass experienced, the spatial distortion, the temporal displacement, the multiplication of his own presence and voice through the forest, has never been adequately explained. Similar reports have come from other lost hikers who have been recovered from the Willamette National Forest, though most experience memory gaps similar to Tongass's, and most are unable to provide coherent descriptions of their experiences. The Forest Service has hypothesized that the phenomenon might be related to geomagnetic anomalies or unusual geological formations that could affect GPS accuracy and potentially influence human perception and memory formation. But Thomas Wright knows the truth is different. He knows that the forest can restructure itself. He knows that it can manipulate space and time in ways that defy explanation. He knows that somewhere in that sector of the Willamette National Forest, there exists another version of Thomas Wright, perhaps multiple versions, still walking in circles, still following footprints that lead nowhere, still hearing their own voices calling from invisible sources, still trying to find a hiker who was never supposed to be found, completing a rescue operation that was never supposed to end. Angela Martinez heard the water displacement before she saw anything. The sound of something massive moving upstream against impossible current velocity. She was conducting a salmon spawning count along the Hoh Rainforest River in Washington, a nightly monitoring operation designed to track spawning populations during peak season. The river was swollen from snowmelt, roaring through the canyon at velocities that made even the strongest swimmers helpless against the current. Angela had been a ranger for 7 years, specializing in aquatic ecology and fisheries management, and she'd conducted hundreds of these counts without incident. The mist rising from the cold water was thick enough to reduce visibility to maybe 15 yards in any direction. The sound of the river was constant and overwhelming, a white noise that made radio communication nearly impossible and made hearing anything else through the chaos extremely difficult. It was 2:47 a.m. when Angela first noticed the rhythm of the water movement that didn't correspond to normal current patterns or natural hydraulic flow. Angela was positioned on a rocky outcrop approximately 30 feet above the water level. Her thermal imaging equipment trained on the river to detect spawning salmon and monitor their movements. The thermal imaging showed the normal signatures she expected: cold water, warm-blooded fish, the occasional larger signature that indicated predatory fish or mammals entering the spawning grounds. But one signature was moving upstream with deliberate purpose, maintaining a constant velocity despite water speeds that should have made sustained movement impossible. The signature was massive, much larger than any salmon, larger than any natural predator she would expect to encounter in this river system. Angela adjusted her equipment and attempted to get a visual identification of the object. Through her thermal imaging, She could see the shape more clearly now. It was vaguely humanoid, moving with coordinated arm and leg movements that suggested swimming rather than any natural animal locomotion. But the proportion was wrong. The body was too long, the limbs too extended, the head too small relative to the torso. Angela's thermal imaging showed internal heat signatures, a warm core and warm circulatory system that suggested a mammalian organism. But no mammal she knew of could maintain such sustained upstream movement against such powerful current velocity. She switched to her regular vision scope and attempted to get a visual sighting. The thing surfaced. Just briefly, for maybe 2 seconds, but enough for Angela to see a shape that made her breath catch. It looked almost human, head, shoulders, arms visible above the water. But the proportions were subtly wrong. The skin had a faint luminescence even in the darkness, a quality that suggested bioluminescence or some reflection of the ambient light. The eyes, when they turned toward Angela's position, seemed to focus on her with intelligent awareness. Then it submerged again, continuing its impossible upstream movement. Angela immediately began documenting what she'd observed, her hands shaking as she recorded her observations into her field notes. Large aquatic mammal, humanoid appearance, impossible swimming capability, apparent awareness of observation. She checked her thermal imaging again, and the massive signature was moving in a different direction now. Not upstream, but parallel to the bank, as if whatever it was had changed its trajectory to move closer to Angela's position on the outcrop. She stood up, backing away from the edge of the rocks, her eyes never leaving the water below, where the thermal signature continued to track parallel to her movement. The swimmer surfaced again, this time closer to Angela's position, much closer, maybe only 20 feet away from the outcrop where she was standing. In the darkness and mist, Angela could make out more detail now. The face was almost human, 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. But the features were subtly distorted, as if human form was being approximated, but not quite replicated. The mouth opened, and a sound emerged that made Angela's skin crawl. It was a vocalization, something between a whale song and human speech, a complex series of tones and frequencies that carried meaning, but existed outside any language Angela recognized. The thing seemed to be communicating, trying to establish some form of dialogue. Angela activated her radio and attempted to report her position and what she was observing. Static answered her. Complete radio dead zone despite the equipment being functional. The frequency display showed her radio was attempting to transmit, but no signal was being broadcast. She tried backup frequencies, tried her satellite communicator, nothing. She was completely isolated, unable to call for help, unable to report what she was witnessing. The swimmer began to move toward the outcrop, not swimming anymore, but walking on the bottom of the river, moving through water that was over its head with casual disregard for the current. It climbed onto the rocks with movements that were almost human, water streaming from its body in quantities that seemed impossible, as if it was shedding water that wasn't physically attached to its form. As it emerged fully from the water, Angela could see its complete form. It was essentially humanoid, but constructed of something that wasn't quite flesh. The skin seemed translucent in places, showing internal structures that resembled organs, but were arranged wrong, organized differently than human anatomy would allow. Its height was approximately 7 feet, its build lean but muscular, its eyes maintaining absolute focus on Angela as it moved toward her. Angela backed away, her hand going to the bear spray on her belt. "Stop," she called out, her voice steady despite her terror. "I'm an armed Forest Service ranger. You need to stay back." The creature stopped moving, tilted its head. an almost curious gesture. When it opened its mouth again, sound emerged that was disturbingly close to human speech, though the vocalization seemed to originate from someplace other than a normal throat. "You understand," it said. The words formed imperfectly, the accent non-existent, the inflection wrong, but the meaning clear. "You observe. You record. You try to communicate what you see. But they will not believe you. They never believe you." Angela sprayed her bear spray directly at the creature's face. The chemical irritant hit it with sufficient force to create visible mist around its head. The creature didn't react. It didn't flinch. It didn't even blink. It simply stood there, regarding Angela with what might have been amusement, while the bear spray that should have incapacitated any living organism simply fell away from it, like rain running off a surface that was fundamentally incompatible with adhesion. "I have been in this river for a very long time," the creature said, each word requiring visible effort, each syllable fought for against the constraints of a vocal apparatus that wasn't designed for human speech. "Many years, many seasons. I have learned to move through the water. I have learned to exist in the environment. I have learned to observe the observers. You are not the first to see me. You will not be the last. But you are the first to attempt communication with something other than fear." Angela ran. Her professional composure shattered completely, replaced by primal survival instinct. She sprinted across the rocky outcrop toward the forest access point, abandoning her equipment, abandoning her documentation, concerned only with creating distance between herself and the thing that had emerged from the river. Behind her, she heard the creature's vocalizations continuing, those complex tones that seemed almost like speech, almost like music, almost like something trying desperately to communicate meaning through a medium it had never been designed to use. She made it back to the ranger station in the darkness, arriving in a state of severe psychological trauma. She immediately filed a report with her supervisor, describing what she'd encountered. The following day, a team was deployed to investigate the river sector where Angela had been conducting her count. They found her equipment exactly where she'd left it. Still operational, still recording data. The thermal imaging footage from the equipment showed nothing unusual. No massive heat signature, no impossible upstream movement, no humanoid shape emerging from the water. The footage showed only normal river conditions, normal salmon movement patterns, and thermal signatures consistent with expected aquatic life. Angela was placed on medical leave and underwent psychiatric evaluation. The evaluations indicated severe psychological distress, possible hallucination, potential stress-induced psychotic episode. She was cleared to return to work after 3 weeks, but she requested reassignment to administrative duties rather than field operations. She continues to work for the Forest Service in an office environment, processing paperwork and managing administrative systems, completely removed from any interaction with wilderness areas. During a confidential interview years later, Angela disclosed information she had never included in any official report. She stated that during the time she was spraying bear spray at the creature, she had briefly felt a sense of communication. A moment of understanding, not through language or conventional sensory pathways, but through direct mind-to-mind contact. In that moment of contact, she had perceived something. Not words, but concepts. Understanding. The creature was trying to explain something to her. Something about being old, about being present in the river system for far longer than human civilization had existed. About being unable to communicate with humans because humans didn't possess the necessary sensory apparatus to perceive the signals being broadcast. The creature had been trying to reach out, not to threaten or harm, but to finally establish connection with an intelligence that might be capable of understanding it existed. Angela refuses to return to the Hoh Rainforest River. She experiences severe anxiety whenever she hears water sounds or whenever she's placed in proximity to large bodies of water. She reports occasional dreams in which she hears those vocalizations, the whale song mixed with human speech, calling to her from great distances, inviting her to return to the river, promising that if she would simply return, the understanding they had briefly shared would be expanded, deepened, completed. Thermal imaging equipment has been permanently installed at the Hoh Rainforest spawning grounds, and footage is reviewed regularly by Forest Service biologists. Approximately once per season, thermal signatures appear that don't correspond to any known aquatic species. The signatures always move upstream, always show impossible sustained movement against current velocity, always maintain distance from ranger observation points. The signatures have never been conclusively identified. No specimens have ever been collected. No definitive visual evidence has ever been obtained. But the thermal data continues to accumulate, and the question remains unanswered. What has been living in the Hoh Rainforest River for unknown decades, moving upstream during salmon spawning season, attempting communication with every observer who positions themselves to witness the phenomenon? And why does it continue to return season after season to the same location, maintaining patterns of behavior that suggest not random animal activity, but deliberate, intelligent purpose? David Park's watch showed 6:47 a.m., but the sun still hadn't risen above the horizon. He was conducting winter solstice monitoring at a remote research station in the Tongass National Forest, Alaska, documenting the unique astronomical and ecological phenomena that occurred during the year's shortest day. The assignment was prestigious, one that only senior rangers with scientific backgrounds were selected for. David had been a ranger for 12 years, and this was his third solstice monitoring rotation. The previous two had been routine, documenting sunrise times, recording temperature variations, collecting data on animal behavior patterns during the extended darkness. David had arrived at the station on December 20th, prepared for the standard 22-hour darkness period that characterized the Alaskan winter solstice at this latitude. He had provisions for 5 days, communication equipment, thermal monitoring systems, and comprehensive instrumentation designed to capture detailed environmental data throughout the solstice observation period. The darkness had been complete and total as expected. The sun had set the previous evening and failed to rise. David had conducted his observations through the night, recording temperatures, documenting animal movement, monitoring barometric pressure and atmospheric conditions. At approximately 5:30 a.m., the first hints of dawn should have appeared on the eastern horizon. Subtle at first, a gradual lightening of the darkness rather than the sudden illumination. But at 6 a.m., when David checked his monitoring station windows, the darkness remained absolute. No lightening, no color change in the sky, no indication that dawn was approaching. He consulted his astronomical calculations, his watch, his GPS unit with integrated date and time functions. All confirmed it was past the predicted time of sunrise. The sun should have been visible. David rechecked his calculations, suspecting error. He reviewed the astronomical data he downloaded before arriving at the station. The calculations were correct. The sunrise should have occurred at 10:14 a.m. local time, and it was already 6:47 a.m. The sun was due to rise in approximately 3 hours and 27 minutes. David attempted to contact the main ranger station to report the delay, but his radio transmission resulted only in static. He tried multiple frequencies, satellite phone backup systems, emergency beacon frequencies. Nothing. All his communication equipment was functional. The equipment acknowledged his input, showed transmission indicators, indicated signal strength. But no actual signal was being transmitted. He was completely isolated from external communication. At 10:14 a.m., the precise moment when sunrise should have occurred, David positioned himself at the station window with his measuring instruments and observation equipment, prepared to document the event. The darkness began to lighten, barely perceptibly at first, but definitely, on lightening. David recorded the color changes, the progression from absolute black to deep blue to lighter blue that preceded normal sunrise. He documented the gradual increase in visible light, the expansion of visible objects within the station's view range, the return of color and contrast to the landscape. By 10:47 a.m., the landscape was illuminated as if in full daylight. The sun, however, never appeared. There was no visible disk on the horizon. No solar position could be established. The light was coming from everywhere and nowhere. Ambient illumination that filled the landscape without any identifiable light source. David consulted his astronomical instruments. His light meters showed normal daylight illumination levels. His color temperature measurements indicated normal solar spectrum light. But his telescope, pointed toward where the sun should have been positioned, showed nothing. An empty sky. Stars visible despite the daylight illumination. Planets visible. Other celestial objects clearly defined. But no sun. The sun had simply failed to appear, and some unknown source was providing daylight illumination that mimicked the sun's normal spectrum and intensity perfectly. At approximately 2 p.m., David noticed his watch was displaying different time information than his backup chronometer. His watch showed 2:14 p.m. His backup timer showed 11:47 a.m. His laptop computer showed 1:33 p.m. His GPS unit showed 3:22 p.m. All the timing devices in the station were displaying different times. David attempted to synchronize them using external time sources, but his internet connection was non-functional. His satellite time sync failed to connect. He was unable to establish an external reference point to determine which timing device was correct, or if all of them were equally wrong. The light in the landscape began to dim at approximately what David calculated to be around 3 p.m., though the accuracy of that estimation was now questionable. The daylight illumination gradually decreased, returning to twilight conditions and then to complete darkness. But the sun never set. There was no horizon observation, no gradual transition through color changes. The illumination simply ceased, returning to the absolute darkness that had characterized the pre-dawn period. David checked his various timing devices. His watch showed 4:33 p.m. His backup showed 6:14 p.m. His laptop showed 5:02 p.m. His GPS showed 3:47 p.m. The times had shifted again, no longer synchronized with each other. David attempted to sleep, but his circadian rhythms had been completely disrupted. He slept for what felt like 3 hours and woke to find his watch showing only 14 minutes had elapsed. He slept again for what felt like 6 hours and woke to find his watch showing 3 hours had passed. His body's sense of time was becoming increasingly unreliable. He began relying on his astronomical instruments, measuring the rotation of the celestial sphere, calculating approximate time, passage based on star positions. But the stars seemed to be rotating at inconsistent rates, sometimes appearing stationary for extended periods, then moving rapidly, then returning to motion. The temperature in the research station began to drop. Steadily. Consistently. David checked the heating systems. They were functioning normally, burning fuel at expected rates, producing normal heat output. But the ambient temperature in the station continued to decline. David layered clothing, activated emergency heat generators, attempted to insulate the structure. Nothing stopped the gradual temperature decrease. The thermometer readings dropped from 18 degrees Celsius to 10 degrees to 0 degrees to minus 10 degrees. At minus 20 degrees Celsius, the electronic equipment began to malfunction. David's laptops shut down. His GPS units froze. His communication equipment became unresponsive. The stars visible through the windows began to change position, rapidly, in ways that violated all astronomical principles. Constellations that should have required hours to rotate through visible arcs were moving in seconds. The North Star was shifting position. The celestial equator was tilting. The entire night sky was reorganizing itself around David's position. He stood at the window, watching the cosmic dance, comprehending that something fundamental about reality was fractured, that the basic rules governing celestial mechanics and orbital dynamics were being suspended or rewritten. The darkness returned. Complete, total, absolute. But this time it didn't transition into partial light. It remained complete darkness for what David calculated, based on star position calculations, to be approximately 23 hours. Then, as suddenly as it had become dark, illumination returned. But it wasn't solar spectrum illumination. The light was blue-shifted, creating a cold luminescence that made the landscape visible, but gave everything an otherworldly appearance. The shadows were wrong. The colors were wrong. The sense of three-dimensional space was distorted. David's perception of distance and perspective became unreliable. This cycle continued. Light of varying colors and intensities, darkness of varying durations, stars rotating at varying speeds, time increasingly incoherent across all available measurement devices. David's mental state began to fragment. He couldn't determine if he'd been at the research station for 3 days or 3 weeks. His food supplies gave him some indication of passage. He was consuming them at normal rates based on hunger. But time itself had become a meaningless concept. He was existing in a cycle of light and darkness that bore no relationship to normal solar cycles, normal astronomical progressions, or normal temporal progression. On what he calculated to be approximately day 27 of the observation period, though his certainty was minimal, David heard a sound. A deep, resonant frequency emanating from the earth beneath the research station. Not vibration, sound, audible sound. The frequency was so low, it was almost below human hearing threshold. But it was definitely there, definitely intentional, definitely directed upward from the ground beneath the station. The sound continued for approximately 3 minutes, then ceased. When it stopped, the sky transformed completely. The darkness became lighter. The stars returned to normal positions and normal rotation rates. The light took on familiar color temperatures. And then, at approximately 10:14 a.m., on what David's calendar indicated was still the morning of the winter solstice, the sun appeared. A normal sun, rising on a normal horizon, creating normal shadows, producing normal light spectrum illumination. The landscape snapped back into familiar configuration. The seasons seemed to reset. The temperature in the research station climbed to normal levels. The electronic equipment reactivated spontaneously. David's watch showed 10:14 a.m. His backup chronometer showed 10:14 a.m. His GPS showed 10:14 a.m. All his timing devices were synchronized, all showing identical time. David checked his calendar. It was still December 21st. The solstice had passed. Normal daylight cycles were apparently being resumed. David waited at the research station for the scheduled extraction helicopter. It arrived as planned, and the pilot seemed completely unconcerned about the duration of David's assignment. When David asked about the unusual duration of darkness, the pilot was confused. Unusual duration? You've been there 3 days. That's the standard rotation. David checked his field notes. 17 days. He had documented 17 days of monitoring. His detailed observations, his equipment readings, his handwritten notes all confirmed 17 days of anomalous phenomena. But the calendar, his watch, the helicopter pilot's data, all indicated only 3 days had passed. David was medically evaluated upon return to the main ranger station. No physical abnormalities were found, no signs of extended exposure or deprivation. His body showed no evidence of 17 days of exposure to sub-zero temperatures. His psychological evaluations indicated stress and disorientation, but no evidence of hallucination or delusion. David was cleared to return to duty, but he requested reassignment out of Alaska. He transferred to Ranger service in the continental United States and took a position in administrative support rather than field operations. He maintains that he experienced 17 days of anomalous temporal and astronomical phenomena. His field notes documenting those 17 days are on file with the Forest Service, preserved in archival storage. Occasionally, researchers request access to those notes, attempting to identify explanations for the phenomena David described. No satisfactory explanation has ever been established. The astronomical data David recorded doesn't correspond to any known variation in solar position or celestial dynamics. The temperature fluctuations he documented are inconsistent with any known meteorological patterns. The light color variations he measured don't correspond to any known atmospheric phenomena. David lives in Colorado now, working as an administrative analyst for the National Forest Service. He maintains a strict schedule. He consistently tracks time across multiple devices. He has become somewhat obsessive about temporal consistency. When interviewed about the experience years later, he made one statement that lingered with interviewers. "I don't think the sun failed to rise that morning. I think it did rise, exactly as scheduled, exactly as it always does. But something was preventing me from perceiving it. Something was altering my relationship to time itself, creating the illusion that dawn hadn't occurred when actually I was moving through hours and days in a way that was synchronized with a different temporal framework than normal Earth rotation. The sun rose perfectly. I just wasn't experiencing the same day that the sun was rising through." The research station in Tongass National Forest continues to be staffed during winter solstice observation periods. Rangers who have worked subsequent shifts at the station report that equipment malfunctions are common, that time tracking becomes inconsistent, that the darkness periods sometimes seem extended beyond astronomical calculations. But formal records show all rotations lasting only the expected 3 days. The discrepancy between ranger field observations and official documentation remains unresolved. The question that persists is whether the Tongass National Forest sector experiences an extended solstice period that operates on a different temporal framework than the rest of Earth's rotation, or whether something in that location is actively manipulating human perception of time, creating subjective experiences that don't correspond to objective temporal progression. And more disturbingly, if David Park experienced 17 subjective days, but only 3 objective days passed, where did those 14 days go? Do they still exist somewhere? Do they exist in a parallel temporal framework that continues to cycle through anomalous light and darkness patterns, waiting for the next ranger to arrive and become temporarily trapped in its gravitational pull? Your call to action. If you've experienced anything like these encounters, if you've witnessed something in America's forests that defied explanation, if you've encountered phenomena that didn't correspond to rational understanding, if you've had an experience that changed your perception of what's possible in the wilderness, we want to hear from you. Visit Verified Fears on YouTube to share your story, submit your documentation, and become part of our growing archive of verified encounters. Your testimony matters. Your experience deserves to be documented. Your voice deserves to be heard. Subscribe to Verified Fears for weekly deep dive investigations into documented cases, real ranger testimonies, and the unexplained phenomena occurring in America's most remote and challenging wilderness environments. We're building a community of people who understand that the forests hold secrets. Secrets that mainstream science and official records refuse to acknowledge. Contact us at verifiedfearsugmail.com if you have documented cases, investigation proposals, or if you're a ranger, scientist, or wilderness professional with verified encounters you're willing to share. We prioritize ranger testimonies and seek partnerships with legitimate Forest Service personnel willing to help us document the truth about what's really happening in America's wettest, darkest rainforests. The stories are real. The encounters are documented. And the truth is waiting in the darkness between the trees, in the fog-covered clearings, in the places where civilization ends and something far older begins. Verified Fears, where documented cases become undeniable truth.